CD 4. Chapter 12. Faith stared dreamily at the welcome sign and the land beyond it. How could anyone look at this view without imagining owning it, making it home? But she quickly shook herself. She was supposed to be keeping Monty grounded, not letting him get carried away before he'd analysed all the facts. "It's only a sign," she forced herself to say as he slid back into the driver's seat. "Let's see what the rest of the place has to offer." They drove onwards, admiring the healthy-looking cattle in the lush green paddocks on either side of them. It was a novelty, seeing cows rather than sheep, and having always had a soft spot for cattle, Faith couldn't help but smile. They passed a couple of ancient windmills, and then, closer to the house, some modern ones that looked fully functional. They registered 2 of the sheds Monty had mentioned, and saw a number of dams before the drive forked. Nestled between the 2 roads was a sight that made them both gasp. Wow. Faith couldn't say anything else, and Monty appeared speechless. He stopped the ute, and they both stared open-mouthed at the kind of homestead she'd only ever seen in chic outback magazines. Although still a fair distance away, she took in the vastness of the old building, early 1900s, she imagined, with its gorgeous verandas all around, stone walls and shiny tin roof. "Didn't you say 4 bedrooms? That place looks like it could house a football team." "And look at the gardens," Monty said in awe. She dropped her gaze from the house to focus on the positively gorgeous blooms that thrived in a number of raised garden beds. A low iron fence bordered a yard that looked like a feature on Gardening Australia. Before she could comment, the front door burst open, and 2 people hurried down the garden path. Monty got out of the ute to greet them. Faith undid her seatbelt and followed. They were met by a couple whom Faith guessed to be in their late 60s or even early 70s. The man towered above her, his height on a par with Monty's, but he didn't look as sturdy as Monty. Despite the smile lines etched into his face, she could tell working on the land had taken its toll. He was lanky and tanned and tired-looking. In contrast, his wife had ample padding around her waist, where an apron was tied, as if she'd been baking. A no-fuss ponytail confined her long grey hair at the nape of her neck. "You must be Daniel." The man held out his hand, and Monty shook it. "Lovely to meet you," said his wife, offering her hand in quick succession. "I'm Nora, and this is Tim." "We're so pleased you've come to look around." Tim's smile reminded Faith of Santa Claus. "And who is this?" "Yes, who is this lovely lady?" Nora asked, looking her up and down in a manner totally different from the girls of the alumnae. Sometimes in life you met someone and immediately felt as if you'd found a like soul. Nora was one such person. Faith beamed at the old couple as Monty spoke. "This is Faith." He smiled and pulled her into his side. Faith's heartbeat quickened, and her temperature rose at the feel of her body melded with his. She tried to overrule the ridiculous reaction with logic. He was holding her like a friend, but her errant hormones refused to take the hint. She struggled from Monty's embrace and offered her hand out as well, first to Nora, then to Tim. "Lovely to meet you." "You have a beautiful house," Monty said, taking another glance out across the ocean of colours, "and your garden is amazing." Nora grinned, and the smile lines around her eyes became even more defined. "Do you like gardening?" she asked, looking to Monty. He gave a firm nod. "Yeah, I do, actually. My own garden has been sadly neglected due to lack of time these last few years, but I do a lot of odd jobs around town and there's often gardening involved." "Oh, well, that's lovely," Nora sighed, and Faith thought she detected a glisten of water in the older woman's eyes. "It'd be nice to sell the place to someone who would look after my roses." "I'd do my best," Monty promised. "Now, you 2 must be exhausted after such a long drive," Nora said, tucking strands of flyaway grey hair behind her ears. "Let's have a nice cup of tea and some lunch, and then we'll show you around the place." Tim patted his stomach. "Good idea." Although Faith saw the slightest glimmer of disappointment in Monty's eyes, he'd be eager to have a look around the property, he didn't let their hosts notice. Instead, he covered his impatience with a charming grin and nodded towards the house. "Lead the way, Nora." He'd have the older woman eating out of his hand within 5 minutes. If the outside of the homestead was impressive, the inside made Faith want to set up camp on the padded sofa and never, ever leave. She tried to think how she'd describe the decor to Jenny, because Lord knew Monty wouldn't think to. It was a magical combination of early 19th century furniture and modern comforts. In the kitchen, they sat down around a massive handmade oak table, which was obviously the hub of the house. A pot of soup simmered on the stove. Warm, freshly cooked bread rested on a plate on the bench, and a couple of racks of biscuits lay cooling nearby. The combined aroma reminded her of Christmas time when her mum was still alive. "Is there anything I can do to help?" she asked, as Nora distributed bowls between them. "No, you just relax." Nora patted her on the shoulder as she turned back to the stove to grab the soup. "You've been driving all day." Actually, Monty did all the driving. He's particular like that. She winked at him across the table and felt a friendly kick to her shins. Nora chuckled. "Tim's just the same. The only time he ever let me drive him around was when he had his hip operation a couple of years back." "Don't remind me." Tim visibly shuddered. Nora ladled a generous serving of hearty minestrone soup into each of their bowls, and then offered bread rolls around the table. Faith hadn't thought she could eat another thing after all the biscuits they'd gorged on during the journey, but at the smell of the soup, her stomach rumbled in anticipation. She took a roll and passed the basket to Monty. As the four of them ate, Monty, Faith, and even Tim complimented Nora on her culinary skills. Tim's voice shone with adoration and pride as he looked towards his wife and thanked her for lunch. Faith hoped one day she would experience that kind of love, the kind that lasted through decades and was still as strong as the day you met. She became uncharacteristically teary at the thought, and was grateful when the conversation turned to business. "I guess Mac has explained our situation," Tim said, pushing his bowl away a little and glancing between Faith and Monty. It was obvious he thought them a couple. She wondered whether she should say something to make it clear she was only here for support. Monty nodded, finished his mouthful, and rested his spoon in his empty bowl. He said you wouldn't sell to just anyone, that you wanted someone who'd love the land and be a part of it. He said you refused to sell to some big company who couldn't give a rat's about anything bar the bottom line. That's right. Tim scowled at the notion. Farming is supposed to be a way of life, not a get-rich-quick scheme. This land, he raised his arms and gestured out the open kitchen window into the paddocks beyond, has been good to me. But we've been good to it, too. Yes, you want to earn money, enough to feed your family and live an honest life. But you need to respect the land, love it. At least that's my philosophy. Watch your heart, love, Nora warned, as Tim's voice became louder and more animated. Tim ignored the warning, continuing with equal fervour. I've had 2 bigwigs from the city come in here and offer me big bucks for this property, for our home. One wanted to plant bloody trees everywhere. Trees! And the other wanted to combine it with next door's property and bring in a farm manager. No love at all in their offer. I want someone who has the land in their blood. Someone who treats stock like animals, not numbers. Someone with a family to bring noise and laughter to these walls. Monty bowed his head. I'm sorry, Tim, I don't have any children. Tim brushed off this comment with a wave of his arm and a wink at Faith. Plenty of time for that, isn't there? As she blushed, he added, It's what's in here that matters. He knocked his knuckles against his chest and fixed his gaze on Monty. Do you have the kind of passion I'm looking for? Yes, sir. Monty's Adam's apple bobbed slowly up and down, but he seemed unable to make any further comment. Faith bit down on the confirmations that were itching to burst forth from her mouth. She had to let Monty sell himself. This was his baby. Finally, he found his voice. Sorry, he said quickly. This just means so much to me. But yes, I do have that passion. For as long as I can remember, I've wanted my own farm. I've lived briefly in the city, I've worked other trades, but my heart hasn't been in any of them. I always thought I'd inherit my family farm, but my parents sold it before I was old enough to take over. He sniffed, and Faith stiffened, her heart breaking at the emotion in his words. That day, Monty continued, I vowed that I would save enough to one day buy my own farm, to be the farmer I always dreamed of being. Pure instinct made Faith reach sideways and take his hand in her own. Pride swelled her heart. She squeezed, and he squeezed back. I've spent years working hard to achieve this goal, but I'm tired of being just an employee. I want to be my own boss." As she watched him, Faith swore she saw water glistening in the corners of Monty's eyes. "This is what I've wanted my whole life. I promise, if you decide to sell your property to me, I'll do everything within my power to care for it the way you would." When Monty finished talking, they both looked to Tim and Nora for their reaction. Silence rang out in the old kitchen for a few moments, then a massive grin cracked open on Tim's face. "In that case, let's do the tour." As Tim stood, Nora complained, "Let the poor kids have a slice of my apple cake first. Plenty of time to look around." Monty's shoulders slumped, and it was Faith's turn to kick him under the table. He straightened immediately and tried for a smile. "That sounds delicious, Nora." Tim sighed, but sank back into his chair nevertheless. Somehow they found room for a slice of warm apple cake and cream, and then finally the time came to tour the property. Nora showed Monty and Faith to the bathroom so they could relieve themselves before heading out, and she and Tim went off to the other bathroom, presumably to do the same. When they were out of earshot, Faith grinned at Monty. "You may as well have won lotto." "I know. I can't believe it. He's rather eccentric, isn't he?" "Anyone who's offering what they're offering you has to be a little eccentric. But they're good people. This is the opportunity of a lifetime." She paused, pondering whether she should tell Monty her suspicions. "But I think we may have given them the impression that we're together. Together. He looked a little sheepish. "You noticed that too?" "Yeah, what do you want to do about it?" He sighed. "I know it's not strictly honest, but I get the feeling they'd prefer to sell this place to someone they think will have a family here. Do you reckon you could pretend to be my girlfriend while we're here?" She raised an eyebrow. Well, how things have changed. I do recall only a couple of weeks back you were horrified at the idea." "Cut it out, Faith. You know how much this means to me." He smirked, but there was real terror in his voice. "Will you do it or not?" Unable to resist, she reached up on tippy toes and kissed him on the lips. It was purely platonic, meant to be a bit of a joke, but the effect almost knocked her off balance. He caught her by the elbow, confusion and a flush creeping across his face. "Was that supposed to be a yes?" "Uh-huh." Then, in an attempt to catch her breath, she fled into the toilet. What the hell was she thinking by kissing him? 10 minutes after feeling Faith's lips against his own, Monty was in the back of a dusty four-wheel drive, trying like hell to concentrate on the words coming out of Tim's mouth. Instead of taking in the layout of the paddocks around him, he kept glancing across at Faith. He kept thinking about how easily she'd fit against him when he'd pulled her into his side to introduce her to the Pattersons, how perfect she'd looked sitting at the big kitchen table in the house he wanted to call home, and even more, how that brief brush of her lips had set off a chain reaction of sparks inside him. Sparks. Damn it. Desperately trying to exercise this ridiculous line of thinking, he racked his brain for a sensible question to put to Tim. "What was the rainfall last year? Have you sown any other crop besides canola?" Tim rattled off numbers and gave a rundown of his crops over the last few years. He also spoke about the seasonal workers he contracted and how he'd needed more help than he could afford since he'd had his hip operation. They spent the next couple of hours surveying every inch of Clancy's breakaway. Everything from the fences to the buildings and livestock was in such good order that Monty really couldn't believe his luck when Tim started talking as if the deal was done. He hoped he wasn't getting in over his head, but wasn't about to let fear of the unknown and a couple of thousand cows put him off. When Faith let slip a yawn, Nora said, "You two must be knackered. Let's head back to the homestead and have something to eat." Tim's wife and Faith had that in common. They were always trying to feed people. "I'm fine," Faith argued, but Nora wasn't having any of it. "Nonsense! Tim and Daniel can talk any further business in the warmth and comfort of the house." The four of them bundled back into Tim's four-wheel drive and headed for the homestead. "Now you two will stay in our guest room, won't you?" Monty guessed this room held one big bed, and whereas usually this wouldn't faze him, right now the idea of sharing such an intimate space with Faith didn't seem such a good one. Her long legs in skinny-fit denim jeans left little enough to his imagination as it was. "Thank you, but you've already been far too kind," he said forcefully. "We've got my tent and our swags. We'll be quite fine." "Sleeping under the stars," Nora sighed wistfully. "So romantic. All right, you lovebird, suit yourself. But do promise you'll come in if it gets too chilly overnight." "We will," Monty agreed, the words romantic and stars ringing loud and clear in his mind. Leaving Tim and Nora alone to organise dinner and locate the last few years' farm records for Monty to look over, he and Faith trekked a short way away from the house and set up his tent. As usual, Faith worked as hard as any bloke to erect the tent, and then crept inside to straighten out their swags, with the kind of touch only a woman could. She was wrong in thinking she wasn't feminine. He may have only just noticed, but she was everything any man would want in a wife. Good on the farm, an excellent cook, the best sense of humour, and a body to run your hands over, and any man but me, that is. Monty chastised himself for having such thoughts about his best mate. That was asking for trouble. How many good friendships had he seen ruined because of sex? And then there was the fact he was practically dating Ruby. Guarding his thoughts, he kept his distance and gathered a few sticks for a campfire in case they needed one in the cool of the evening. "You okay?" Faith asked, emerging from the tent. He straightened from where he'd been bending to pick up a stick. "Sure, why wouldn't I be?" "You seem a bit jumpy," she approached him. "If you're worried about what Tim and Nora think of you, then stop right there. They're already convinced you're the perfect man for this place, and I know they're absolutely right." "Thanks, Faith." He looked into her familiar eyes and smiled. Her words were those of a friend, but he couldn't help feeling there was something more in the air between them this evening. Something stronger. "Come on," she said, linking her arm through his, apparently oblivious to the something more. "We'd better not keep our hosts waiting." Although they were both wearing jumpers, her heat emanated through the layers of clothing. He thought about how much hotter things could get if there weren't any such barriers between them. Oh, hell, this crazy thinking had to stop. Pretending he had to pull up his socks, he stooped and adjusted his boots unnecessarily. When he stood again, he made the conscious decision not to take her arm. The kitchen door was wide open in welcome when they arrived on the back veranda. They could hear Nora singing as she stirred a pot that looked big enough to feed a small army. Dinner smelled divine, and they yanked off their boots, eager to get inside and taste it. As their boots clunked against the wooden flooring, the older woman spun around and smiled, not at all fazed that she'd been caught in the act of belting out songs along with an old-fashioned wireless. "Hello, you two?" She dumped her wooden spoon on a chopping board, wiped her hands against the apron, and turned off the radio. "Now what can I get you to drink?" Before they could reply, Tim entered, a stubby of beer in his work-roughed hands. "You'll have one of these, won't you, Daniel?" "Sounds good, mate." Monty had never felt more in need of a beer. "What about you, Faith?" Tim asked. "Shall I open a bottle of wine for you and Nora?" Faith glanced at Nora and then back to Tim. "To be honest, I'm not much of a wine drinker. I'd kill for a beer, though." Tim slapped her on the back and she jolted slightly. "That's the spirit. I love a girl who knows how to drink." Faith blinked, looking slightly bemused. Tim went to the fridge and returned with 4 fresh cans. "Nora is exactly the same, only she pretends to be a lady when we've got guests." "I'll be off with you," Nora said, as she took the can and cracked it open. "Now all we need is a deck of cards, a few good belches, and we'll have ourselves a right old night." Tim guffawed and pulled a seat out from around the table. "Sit down, kids." Nora shook her head, took a sip of her beer, and turned back to her dinner preparations. Monty looked across to see Faith stifling a giggle. If only he could just relax a bit, they might all have a very good night. Chapter 13. Faith wasn't sure how many beers she'd had. She'd lost count a couple of hours ago. Or how many serves of Nora's lethal sticky date pudding. They'd migrated to the lounge room after dinner, and she'd lost every game of blackjack since. She was glad they weren't playing strip poker, because from where she was sitting, Monty looked mighty fine even with all his clothes on. When Nora yawned and Tim lost yet another hand to Monty, the older couple decided it was time to call it a night. The 4 of them struggled to standing, then stumbled down the corridor to the back door, almost as one. Tim took hold of Faith and Monty in one hearty embrace, his firm fingers gripping into their shoulders. "Thanks for a great night, friends. I'll be calling Mac first thing tomorrow. It would be my honour if you would take the reins of our beloved home." "Oh, thanks, mate." Monty clapped Tim on the back, letting the older man decide when to let them go. Faith merely smiled, suffering a smidgen of guilt at the way they were deceiving this lovely couple. Although, right now, the way she felt, it was anything but deception. She'd spent all night gazing around the homestead, fantasizing about living here herself, fantasizing about setting up house with Monty and building a life together. It was probably why she'd played so dismally at cards. "Now, are you sure you two are going to be okay out there in the cold?" Nora's concerned voice jarred her thoughts, snapping her back to reality. "Yes, thank you so much for dinner, and such a good night." Faith gave Nora a quick hug. She swayed a little and felt Monty's steadying hand on her back. It burned, sending short, sharp, sensual messages to every nerve ending in her body. Without removing his hand, he pecked a quick kiss on Nora's cheek and echoed Faith's sentiments. "You two are the greatest," he said, ushering her towards the door. "See you in the morning." "Bright and early for a cooked breakfast," Nora promised. Tim wrapped his arm around Nora's shoulders, and they stood in the doorway as they waved Faith and Monty into the night. Faith shivered as they stepped off the veranda, and Monty pulled her into his side. He'd done the same on numerous occasions, but it felt different tonight. Her whole body was on edge, and she imagined that if she breathed too deeply, if she thought too hard about just how close he was, she might actually combust. "Bit chilly tonight, isn't it?" Monty rubbed his hand up and down her arm. She swore his voice was rougher than usual. Yes." There may have been goosebumps on her flesh, but inside she felt anything but cold. With his other hand, he dug his mobile out of his pocket and, using the flashlight app, lit the way in front of them. They stumbled in silence to their tent. The campfire was ready to be lit, but it was much later than they'd envisaged getting back. She doubted Monty could be bothered lighting it, and she couldn't summon the enthusiasm either. "It was a great night, wasn't it?" Monty stopped just in front of the tent, as if unsure about heading inside. Although still holding her, he angled his face and body so he could look into her eyes. Moonlight shone through a gap in the trees beside them, and what she saw sent a jolt to her heart. The moon emphasized his 5 o'clock shadow, which in turn highlighted the perfection of his strong, sculpted jawline. She swallowed, nodded her head, but couldn't speak. While she fought the impulse to reach up and touch that jawline, she felt fingers on her face, running down over her cheek, across her lips. His touch was so light she wondered if she were dreaming. Again. "You were brilliant today. I don't know what I've done to deserve your support, but I couldn't get by without it." He pulled her close, and desperate for his warmth, craving this blissful attention, she was helpless to resist. As their bodies melded together, his thumb paused on her lips, a tantalizing pressure. "Nora and Tim adored you." He paused, then added, "I adore you." For a crazy moment she thought, if he adores me so much, why doesn't he kiss me? And suddenly he was doing just that. If logic and sense paid a visit, she ignored them, relishing the feel of his lips against hers, relishing the culmination of what she'd been imagining all night. Her fingers crept round his back and gripped his shoulders as she kissed him like she'd never kissed anyone before. Fireworks exploded around her head, inside her body, everywhere. Nothing, never, no kiss had ever compared to this. She pulled him closer, ran her hands up into his hair, tangling her fingers in the messy locks she'd teased him about so often. She feasted on him like a wild child, scared that if she slowed, this brilliant fantasy would end, that maybe she'd wake up. Minutes that felt like hours later, they needed air. As Monty gasped in the icy night breeze, she whispered, "I adore you too, Monty." Her words were slurred, but he didn't seem to notice, didn't seem to care. Instead, he took her hand, looked into her eyes, and asked a question, not with words, but with one sultry look. Her smile gave her consent, and within seconds they were tumbling backwards, pausing only to tear up the zip on the tent, before collapsing on top of their waiting swags. She couldn't tell who hit the ground first, but they both reached for one another, tearing at each other's clothing like hungry beasts. In complete darkness and with no method to their madness, they didn't seem to be getting anywhere, so Faith pulled back and took care of her own clothes. Monty did the same, and when he reached for her again, she felt his warm, naked flesh against hers. A moan of approval slipped from her lips. Damn the dark. She willed her eyes to adjust so she could look her fill at the specimen beside her. And then he was touching her. He pulled her towards him, tugged a blanket over the top of them, and smoothed her hair. You okay? Okay. Words could not do justice to her level of okayness. Why had they never gone here before? Yes. She kissed him before he could ask any more questions, and it felt oh so right, as if she'd been born to kiss him, as if this action were as old as time. He tasted so good, a delicious mixture of sticky date pudding, beer, and the port they'd finished off the evening with. His lips still devouring hers, he moved his hand lower, trailing his palm over her shoulder, down across her neckline, and then he cupped her breast. She gasped as his rough and calloused skin played against her smooth flesh. His fingers twirled around one nipple, pebbling it hard, then reached across and gave her other breast equal attention. A voice inside her whispered that she should be touching him back, giving him pleasure, but it seemed her nipples had a direct line to her feminine core, because when he placed his mouth over her breast, teased and sucked, she almost came. But she didn't want this to be over, not yet. Dream or reality, she was having too much fun. You're beautiful, Faith. You've always been beautiful. Oh, Monty. There were tears welling, but she bit them back. Shut up and kiss me again. His laugh was music to her ears. His words were like drugs to an addict. I can do better than that. And then he closed the gap so you couldn't have slid a ruler between their bodies, and the hand that had been bestowing devout attention on her breast only moments before moved lower. As Monty came down from what was, without doubt, the best sex of his life, reality hit. His eyes now adjusted to the darkness, he could just make out the outline of Faith's incredible body lying on the swag beside him. Her arm lay flung across her forehead, and slow pants escaped her mouth, as if she too was catching her breath. She was beautiful, utterly gorgeous. But what the hell had they just done? He groped blindly for his clothes, located something which felt like his top, and yanked it over his head. His jeans came next, his mind whirring with thoughts as he yanked up his fly. Monty? Faith sat up beside him. Are you okay? His heart was beating so damn fast he thought he might be having a heart attack. He had the best friend ever in Faith, someone he could turn to at all hours of the day, someone who knew his darkest secrets and fears. Well, more than anyone else did, anyway. So why had he gone and risked it all with a drunken fumble in his tent? I'm so sorry. He forced out the words, wishing this were a nightmare instead of reality, as he felt around for his boots. I shouldn't have taken advantage of you. I'm an idiot. Damn it, he couldn't find them. But he needed to escape, couldn't bear the confines of the tent any more. Monty, stop. Her voice was desperate, a little angry. You weren't the only one who just did what we did. Slow down a minute. Relax. He sighed deeply, stilled his frantic search, and turned to face her. Thank God for the dark. He didn't want to see echoed in her eyes the regret he felt. He listened as she searched around for her clothes and dragged them on. Neither of them said anything for at least a minute. Faith then announced, I need a Panadol, which only emphasized how wrong this had been. They'd fallen into bed after an enjoyable evening of fun and flirtation, but the flirtation had been a front, an act for their hosts. I've got some in the ute, he said, grabbing the opportunity to escape. He stood and hurried outside, gasping the cold night air into his lungs as he tramped across the moist ground. The damp soaked into his socks, and the reality of what they'd done quickly sobered him. He rummaged in the glove box for the painkillers and took them back to the tent. Here you go. He tossed her the box through the tent flap. He'd already decided not to go any farther in. There's no point talking about this now. We both need rest. I'll spend the night in the ute. Sweet dreams. Sweet dreams. Faith spoke these words aloud, but Monty had already gone. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry or go the whole hog and do both. How was she supposed to get any sleep at all after what they'd just done? After his absolutely horrified reaction? She thought back to when they'd first kissed. It had felt real, not just a stupid, drunken pash. But was that only because it had been more for her? Oh, sheesh. She fell back onto their swags and pulled as much warmth as she could find around her. She was so cold she could feel her heart shaking. Part of her wanted to storm after Monty and have it out with him, make him do the unmanly thing and talk, but another part was afraid of what he might say. She squeezed her eyes shut and tried to hold on to the absolute bliss she'd felt only minutes earlier, when their bodies had been in perfect harmony. Being together like that had felt so damn right, like her world had been off-axis all her life and had suddenly righted itself. For however long their beautiful frenzy lasted, she'd been absolutely certain that this was the final piece in the jigsaw puzzle of her life. She couldn't believe she'd wasted all these years looking for someone else. The love she'd been looking for had been here, right under her nose all along. The sparks she'd experienced with Monty couldn't be faked. But, and there was always a but, when things seemed too good to be true, they usually were. She was somewhere on the scale between tipsy and pissed, and she didn't think her actions were solely because she'd had too much to drink. But how could she tell? Maybe it was the alcohol. Or maybe it was a combination of things. Ruby's sudden interest in Monty, the way she'd placed him in the role of her boyfriend at the old girls' night, and the fact that his moving away had suddenly become a reality. All these things were working together to make her crazy. She groaned and then laughed, but it was bittersweet. Sex with her best friend. Of all the cliches. Maybe it would be one of those crazy stories they brought up in years to come. Remember that time we got drunk and slept together? With that final thought, she drifted into a fitful sleep. Sleeping in a ute should be a form of torture, along with castration, kneecapping, and depriving someone of sleep altogether. Monty woke, if he could call it that when he'd barely slept a wink, with the dawn. Hands linked behind the back of his head, he reclined in the driver's seat and watched as the night retreated. A vivid orange painted the sky as a ball of bright gold slowly crept up from the distant dirt. Not far off he heard the sounds of cattle lowing. He could get used to waking up here. But like every other thought he'd tried to focus on throughout the night, his mind only remained faithful to the sunrise for so long before it snapped back to faith. He glanced sideways, but saw no signs of life coming from the tent. It was hard to believe that only hours before it had been rocking as he and Faith stepped over a boundary that had been unspoken for years. Every time he thought about what they'd done, his stomach ached. How could he ever look her in the eye again, knowing what it felt like to touch her, to be inside her? Realizing his fists were tightly clenched, he decided a morning walk might clear his head. Tim wouldn't mind him having a look around on his own, and it would help rid his body of some of the tension. It would be good to get the lie of the land, and he also needed the time to think. Or not. Yes, that would definitely be preferable. It was only when he quietly closed his ute door that Monty remembered his boots were still in the tent. Damn it, he cursed under his breath. Deciding to forego the footwear, he strode in the opposite direction, heading out across the farm. As he hoped, the distraction of the land and stock that would soon be his helped to keep his mind off Faith. He walked for miles, taking a second look at the places Tim and Nora had shown them yesterday. He stopped to investigate the soil, to examine one freshly seeded paddock, and he dreamed ahead about what he might do differently in years to come. When the sun had truly risen in the sky and the promise of a gorgeous autumn day hung in the air, he decided it was time to head back. He hadn't been walking more than 2 minutes when Tim's ute appeared over a rise and slowed when he approached. "Morning, Sonny." Tim leaned out the driver's side window. "You're keen. Thought you might need a sleep-in after last night." "You have no idea," thought Monty. He smiled at the older man and lifted his hand in a greeting. "Nah, I'm fine. Thought I'd have another look around. I hope you don't mind." "Not at all. It'll be yours soon anyway." Tim gestured to the passenger seat. "I've been out feeding our bulls, just heading back for breakfast now. Want a ride?" "That'd be great." He jogged round and climbed in. "Nice top," Tim said with a laugh. Monty glanced down and groaned. How had he not realised he'd slept in Faith's jumper all night? That showed just how all over the place he was. Thanks." "Forgot your boots too, eh?" Monty racked his brain for a reasonable explanation. "Well, no need to be sheepish with me, son. I was young once." He didn't know how to reply, and Tim didn't appear to expect him to. As they neared the old building, Monty wondered if Faith was already inside talking to Nora. The thought twisted a knot in his stomach. "Good morning, boys," Nora said as they entered the kitchen. Eggs and bacon sizzled in a pan on the stove. There was no sign of Faith. "Haven't seen Faith yet?" he asked, hoping his tone didn't give away his anxiety. "The poor lass is probably still resting." Nora smiled and continued cooking. "We gave her quite a night last night." Monty breathed a sigh of relief, then silently berated his stupidity. They'd have to face each other sooner or later. He shuffled from side to side, glancing backwards out the kitchen window. He could just make out the outline of the tent through the garden shrubbery. "I guess I'd better wake her." "No, let her sleep. We'll save her some food, won't we, Nora?" As Tim crossed to the sink to scrub up, Monty decided to heed their advice. He washed his hands and asked, "Is there anything I can do to help?" Nora waved him away. "No, sit and have a coffee." No need to ask him twice. Like every meal so far at Clancy's breakaway, breakfast was an elaborate and delicious affair. Monty ate his fill and probably Faith's as well, but Nora promised she had plenty. She piled a spare plate high with bacon, eggs, sausages, tomatoes, beans, and fried potatoes, and placed it in the oven to keep warm. When they'd finished a second cup of coffee and Faith still hadn't appeared, Tim made a suggestion. "Why don't we check on the new calves, if there's time before you have to hit the road?" Monty jumped at the opportunity to spend more time learning about the property. "If Faith shows up, tell her we'll be back soon," Tim instructed Nora. "Aye, aye, Captain." She saluted him with a smile and then took a sip of her tea. "Calving season is only just starting," Tim explained as they headed out to the northern paddocks. "The first few have been born, but things will get busy soon. Their labours are generally pretty straightforward, but sometimes I'll have to come out and lend a hand, and on rare occasions we'll call in the vet." Monty nodded, making mental notes. He ignored the tremor of nerves scuttling up his spine. He'd helped a number of ewes give birth in his time, but never a cow. "The local vet is good?" "The best," Tim confirmed. "Ava recently took over her father's practice. She's only young, but she's damn good at what she does. Hard-working, too. You'd be hard-pushed to find a better vet." "She sounds great. I'll get the gate." Monty's hand was already on the door handle as they slowed in front of the paddock. "Don't worry about closing it again. These girls aren't escape artists, and we won't be here long." When Monty returned to the ute, Tim drove almost into the middle of the paddock and stopped not far away from most of the herd. Monty counted 5 calves. "That one was born overnight." Tim pointed to a calf and its mother, a big grin on his face. To Monty, all the calves looked pretty much the same, and he admired the fact Tim could tell the new one from the rest. They watched for a while, Tim explaining about the breeding program on Clancy's breakaway and how the majority of the calves would be sold once they were weaned. Tim was a special breed of farmer. He not only loved the land, he loved each animal in his care, and although their fate was inevitable, he wanted to make the time they were on his property humane. "Are you sure you're ready to leave this place?" Monty asked, a lump forming in his throat. He couldn't tell if he was feeling sorry for the other man or anxious at the thought of this dream falling through as well. There was a long, uncomfortable pause. Tim finally sighed. "I don't have any choice. I'm not getting any younger, and, unfortunately, as innovative as modern medicine is, they haven't invented the pills I need so I can look after this place forever. My daughter's married city boys, and I failed dismally in passing on the love of the land to any of them anyway. Nora wants to be nearer her grandchildren, and I want to be with Nora. The land may be my life, but Nora is the soul of this place. If she weren't here, it wouldn't be home." Monty nodded at Tim's heartfelt words. "If things work out and I am able to buy your farm, you and Nora will always be welcome here." "You're a good man," Tim said, turning the ute's ignition again. "I know you and Faith will do your best here. Hard as it will be to say goodbye, that knowledge makes it bearable." "Yes, we will." Monty hoped there wasn't a crack in his voice. Lying didn't sit right, but he was terrified that Tim might change his mind if he knew the truth. Chapter 14. Faith woke in the same state as she had woken almost every day for the last few weeks. Hot, sweaty, and bamboozled. She shot into a sitting position and, as she glanced round the messy tent, memories of the night before slammed into her consciousness. Her head fell into her hands, but it wasn't drinking too much the night before that made her head ache. It was the knowledge that last night wasn't just another raunchy dream. This one was real. After a few deep breaths, Faith reached for her phone on the floor of the tent, her eyes widening at the time. She hadn't slept past 10 o'clock in years. Hell, she'd barely slept past 6 since her mum had fallen ill, and she'd taken over the milking duties. Although hiding in the tent seemed far more appealing than facing Monty, she couldn't put it off forever. Besides, she needed coffee. Now. She scrambled around and located her jeans, found a fresh t-shirt in her backpack, and then, because the air down here held more bite than in Bunyip Bay, she looked for her jumper. All she found was the rugby jumper Monty had worn yesterday. Unable to help herself, she scooped it up and brought it to her nose. She breathed in deeply, his unique scent wafting up her nostrils and swirling around her head. Oh, Lord. There was nothing on this earth that had that effect. She lowered the jumper and hugged it to her chest, unable to discard it. What have we done? Somehow, for years, she'd ignored what was right in front of her, not once contemplating Monty as a possible partner. She'd dated other people, lamenting the fact she couldn't seem to get very inspired about any of them. And now the reason had more than made itself known. She was totally, madly in love with Daniel Montgomery. The joyous fluttering in her stomach lasted only moments before she remembered his escape. He'd almost tripped over himself in his rush to leave the tent. To leave her. And his words, "I'm so sorry." The memory of them felt like barbed wire tightening around her heart. But it would have been a shock for him, too. Voices played off each other inside her head. One of them suggested Monty might feel the same, that he wasn't the type of guy to fall between the sheets willy-nilly. But the other quickly retorted that he'd been drunk. People did stupid things when they were drunk. Her included. Faith tried to remember how she'd justified it to herself last night. Reasons why she might be feeling these new emotions towards Monty. The stuff about Ruby, the alumnae, and him moving away. But in the light of day, none of them negated what she felt. Those things might have started her thinking about him as more than a friend, but they'd simply been unveiling an ancient truth. Her heart, too full of Monty, had never had room for anyone else. Perhaps she'd always known this, but had been scared of what she'd lose if he didn't feel the same. Damn it, she was still scared. Outside, a kookaburra laughed. Faith wiped at a few tears that escaped her eyes, not wanting Monty to stumble into the tent and find her in such a mess. The last thing she wanted was to sway his feelings because he felt sorry for her. Discarding his jumper on his swag, she ran her hands through her hair and wished for once she was the type of girl who carried things like a small mirror in her bag. Not to mention concealer and lip gloss. If the pounding in her skull was anything to go by, she probably had puffy eyes and blotchy red cheeks, but she carried nothing with which to do a fix-up job. After pulling on her blundies, she grabbed her toothbrush and hairbrush and peeked through the tent's flap. The area around their camp was deserted. Taking a step out, she stretched her arms above her head, then walked over to Monty's ute and grabbed a bottle of water from the esky. She splashed her face, brushed her teeth, redid her ponytail, then set off for the house. It wasn't much, but at least she wouldn't have crusty eyes and smelly breath. "Hello," she called through the flywire as she reached the kitchen door. Nora appeared from a doorway at the other side of the kitchen. Flushed and wearing an apron splattered with flour, she looked as if she'd been hard at work already. "Come on in, sweetheart. How'd you sleep?" "Yeah, good," which was a miracle. It was waking up she hadn't wanted to do. "Where's Monty?" Nora grinned. "He's such a darling, that boyfriend of yours. He said you needed to rest and we should let you sleep. Not that you need any beauty sleep." "Oh, thanks." Faith wasn't used to compliments about her looks. "He and Tim are off on another drive," Nora explained. "Oh, good." Relief filled Faith that she didn't have to face him just yet. "Do you mind if I use your bathroom?" "Sure, go ahead." Faith slipped off to the bathroom, relieved herself, and then splashed more water on her face. She'd need a shower before she had any hope of looking presentable. When she returned to the kitchen, Nora gestured to the table. "You sit down and I'll get you a cup of coffee. Or would you prefer tea? I kept a plate of breakfast for you, too." "Oh," Faith didn't want to be rude, but she didn't think she could eat anything without her stomach revolting. "I think I'll stick with just coffee if that's okay. I drank a bit more than I usually do last night." "Didn't we all?" Nora fussed at the bench and then returned with a steaming mug of coffee. She sat alongside Faith. "But it was a great night. Tim will feel so much better about leaving now he's met the two of you and knows the farm will be in such good hands." Faith forced a smile and then took a long sip of her drink. The liquid almost burnt her tongue. She couldn't find the right words to reply. "And I must admit I'm looking forward to being near the grandkids," Nora continued, seemingly oblivious to Faith's discomfort. She leaned across the table and picked up a thick photo album. "Want to see some pics?" "Sure." Faith moved her chair closer, happy for the change of conversation. They spent a few minutes flicking through an album filled with pictures of angelic little children with dusty blonde, ringleted hair. "Oh, that's a shot for the 21st if ever I've seen one." Faith smiled as she pointed to a photo of a child, dressed only in a jumper, his cute little bum sticking up for all the world to see as he bent over a red paddling pool. "That's Max," Nora said, laughing. "He's 10 now and has already threatened to burn that photo. Luckily, our daughter has them all stored away on some fancy computer thing." Looking at the photos made Faith think again about having children. Where once she'd have quickly dismissed the idea, now it didn't seem such a horrific idea. Maybe it was her body clock starting to tick, but she suddenly knew, more than anything, she wanted the chance to bring new life into the world. "I can see the family resemblance in your grandkids," she said. "They're gorgeous." "Well, the gorgeousness is all from my side." Faith laughed, and Nora snapped the book shut with a happy sigh. "Now, would you like to use our shower to freshen up before the men return?" "That would be fantastic." She picked up their empty mugs and took them to the sink to rinse before heading back to the tent. There she cleared it of their swags and other belongings, then dismantled it. When Monty finally returned, the ute would be packed, ready for the long, no doubt uneasy, drive home. Satisfied, she took her bag up to the house, where she slipped into the guest bathroom to scrub her body of all traces of Monty. As she lathered gel all over, she realized it would be much, much harder to erase him from her heart. Monty returned to find their things packed, and Faith just stepping out of the guest bathroom. With wet hair and flushed cheeks, she looked radiant, and his mind took a detour south. How did she manage to look so fresh when he felt as if he'd been on a month-long drinking binge? And more to the point, how had he never noticed such natural beauty before? "Hey," she smiled tentatively, and he nodded back. "Morning." "Actually, it's nearer afternoon," Tim announced, thankfully oblivious to the tension. "Must be almost time for lunch." Monty patted his stomach. "I'm still full from breakfast, and unfortunately, I think Faith and I better be heading off." "Yes." Faith nodded but didn't meet his gaze. "We've got a long drive ahead." A long, awkward drive, no doubt, whether they talked about what they'd done or not. "Yes, of course." Tim didn't sound happy to say goodbye so soon. As the four of them started outside, Nora halted. "You go ahead, I'll be with you in a moment." Tim led Faith down the garden path, talking about the flowers that blossomed in the garden in spring, and Monty found himself following, unable to tear his gaze from Faith's butt. With each stride she took, her jeans tightened, and he couldn't stop thinking about how he'd cupped those buttocks in his hands only hours ago. Oh, boy. He swallowed, blinked, and tried to banish the memory from his mind. At this rate, he wouldn't be able to sit comfortably in his jeans. When they got to the ute, Faith tucked her handbag in the passenger seat, and they turned towards the house to see Nora rushing towards them. "For lunch," she explained, thrusting a brown paper bag at each of them. Monty closed his hand around the bag, which felt warm and smelled suspiciously like homemade pie. "Thanks so much. You really didn't have to." He leaned forward and kissed her on the cheek. Strange how he'd met this couple only yesterday, yet felt like he'd known them much longer. A lot had changed in 24 hours. "Yes, thank you." Faith hugged their hosts, and then Monty shook Tim's hand. "It was great to meet you. Thanks for having us to stay, and for—" How could he properly thank these people, total strangers, for the opportunity they were giving him? It was too big for words. Instead, he reached out and hugged Tim. "I feel a lot better about leaving this old place now I've met you." Tim slapped Monty on the back, something he was beginning to get quite used to. "I'm going inside to ring Mac right away." As they drove up the long gravel driveway, Monty watched Tim and Nora waving them off through the rearview mirror, and a sense of rightness filled him. He couldn't believe the next time he returned, this would all be his. Under normal circumstances, he'd share these thoughts with Faith, but today he kept his mouth shut. They needed to talk, would have to sooner or later, but he didn't know where to start. He guessed Faith felt the same predicament because silence rang between them for a good half an hour. They'd made good progress up the Albany highway when she finally broke it. "Well, that was a successful trip?" Clearly she meant the farm. "Yes, Clancy's breakaway is a dream come true. Thanks again for coming with me." His voice sounded stilted and formal, but he couldn't help it. Faith sighed. "Oh, Monty, what are we going to do? Are we just going to pretend it didn't happen?" If only they could just ignore it. Or even better, turn back time so they'd never been so stupid. "Of course not," he said, "but I don't want to let one mistake ruin years of friendship, do you?" He heard a sharp intake of breath. "No. I think we should be adults about it. We were drunk, neither of us has—" he coughed, "been with anyone in a while, and we got lost in the moment. It's not like we haven't seen each other naked before." "Naked toddlers in a paddling pool is hardly the same thing," she said wryly, "nor is skinny dipping." No. Skinny dipping had never turned him on the way she had last night. He'd feasted on her, explored every intimate inch of her skin, and the feelings it had invoked had been— "Stop. But it's best if we don't do it again. I don't want things getting awkward between us." "Okay then. Let's agree to forget it ever happened." "Yes, forget." It was a good idea. So why did it feel so wrong? And why did Faith sound so unsure? Oh, shit. His heart slammed into his chest cavity, causing him to actually jolt. "What?" "We didn't use any contraception." She sucked in a breath, then slowly let it out again. "It's okay. I'm on the pill." He looked questioningly at her. "Bad skin." She shrugged and gestured to a face that hadn't seen an acne problem in years. "And maybe I'm a little hopeful." He let out a breath of relief as Faith turned to look out the window. Her mention of hope reminded him of the date she'd had with Curtis, which he hadn't asked her about yet. "How are things going with Curtis?" he asked. "I don't want to talk about it." She kept her gaze on the passing paddocks. "That good, then?" He found himself secretly pleased. "What the fuck, Monty? We've just had sex and you're asking about my relationship with a mate of yours? How do you think it's going?" What could he say to that? Tightening his grip on the steering wheel, he focused on the road ahead. The silence was like a lasso tightening around Monty's neck. Unable to bear it, he put some music on, but even when some of his favourite tunes filled the cabin, he couldn't relax. His thoughts drifted to Ruby. He couldn't believe that after actively pursuing her for so long, he'd fucked up in this monumental manner. Although the relationship word hadn't been mentioned, there was no question that he'd betrayed her. He'd need to work out what the hell to do about that. But he couldn't think straight now, not with Faith only centimetres away, the scent of whatever she'd washed her hair with that morning drifting over and teasing him. After another 15 minutes or so, Faith spoke. "Do you mind stopping so I can get my pillow from the back? I'm tired." She'd barely finished her request before he skidded to a halt at the side of the road. He was exhausted too, but at least if she was asleep he could focus on the drive rather than the horrible tension hanging between them. "Thanks." She tossed a tense smile his way as she got out of the ute. On her return, she clicked her seatbelt back into place and leaned her pillow against the window. They hadn't driven more than 500 metres before she was asleep. As Monty drove, he found his gaze drifting sideways. He couldn't seem to stop stealing glimpses at her. She looked mostly peaceful, but even in slumber fine lines creased her brow. He almost reached over and smoothed them, but stopped his hand in midair. She barely made a sound or moved a muscle in the time it took to get to Perth. Having eaten his weekly requirement of food in the last 2 days, he didn't need to stop for takeaway. Yet as he drove past a city travel agent, he found himself pulling into a parking slot just outside. Faith woke at the lack of motion and rubbed her eyes. "Where are we?" He pointed ahead to the travel agency window. She frowned. "Planning a holiday?" "Yes, your dad's. Remember?" "Oh, that." She ran her hands through her hair, tugged a black elastic hairband off her wrist, and shovelled her hair into a ponytail. Wet when they'd left the farm, it had dried into a beautiful tangle of curls. He forced himself to look back towards the row of shops in front of them. "I doubt he'll go for the idea." "You never know if you don't try him. Go on." Faith bit her lip as if in thought, then said, "Okay, back in a moment." He couldn't tell if she agreed with him or was simply jumping at the chance to get out of the car and away from him. Normally he'd follow, but they both needed space today. "I'm going next door to get a bottle of Coke. Want anything?" Yeah, some more water, please." At least she didn't offer to pay for it. That would have really highlighted the chasm between them. When Monty returned to the car, he watched through the travel agency window as she spoke to a young man who appeared to be piling her high with brochures. She laughed at something the other bloke said, and Monty's chest ached at the ease of their conversation. He almost went inside and told her to hurry up, but instead settled for tapping his fingers on the steering wheel while he waited. 5 minutes later she emerged with a massive grin on her face, a skip in her step, and her arms laden with brochures. He reached across and pushed the door open for her. "Thanks." Her smile seemed closer to her usual one. "You've got quite a selection there." She nodded, dumped the pile on her lap, and clicked her seatbelt in. If Dad doesn't find something to entice him here, he never will. As Monty reversed back into the traffic, Faith took the brochure from the top of the pile and opened it. "How does a cruise down the Nile sound?" "As long as there's a stop to see the pyramids, it sounds perfect. I could even be tempted to join him." She snorted. "Now you're just getting carried away." He laughed. She was right. If he ever decided to take a holiday, Frank wouldn't be on his list of top 10 companions. What's next? Let's see. There's a safari in southern and East Africa, or a temple tour of India. Either of those take your fancy? Somehow, those travel brochures kept them going the whole journey back to Bunyip Bay. While they planned holidays for the unsuspecting Frank Forrester, they could forget about the elephant in the cabin between them. But when they turned down the road to Faith's house, the tension returned like a storm cloud to a clear blue sky. Faith gathered up the brochures and sighed heavily as her house, lit up by lights on the veranda, came into view. No doubt her mind was occupied with thoughts of how to say goodbye, as was his. When he stopped the ute, there was no more time for pondering. They unclicked their seatbelts in unison, and he got out to help her with her things. But by the time he arrived at the back of the ute, she'd already hauled her pack onto her back and had the esky in her arms. "It's okay, I can manage," she said, not meeting his gaze. "The esky's light as a feather now. Thanks for Her voice drifted off. "I'm glad Clancy's breakaway looks like a goer for you. Call me once you've talked to Mac." "Will do." He nodded and went to hug her like he'd normally do, but something stopped him at the last moment. Instead, he offered a naff, "Have a good night," and escaped to his ute. As Faith climbed the front steps, she prepared herself for the mess that would be waiting inside. It would be the shitty icing on the crappy cake that had been her day. But maybe it would help take her mind off Monty. How could he shrug his shoulders and suggest they go on like before after what they'd done together? She'd never experienced anything like the pleasure he'd brought her in the tent last night, but maybe it hadn't been as mind-blowingly good for him. Deflated and wishing she could erase the last 2 days, she dumped the esky with its empty containers on the veranda, to be dealt with tomorrow, and entered through the fly screen. 2 steps into the house, she stumbled and glanced around in shock. What the? As she ventured farther inside, she frowned at the tidy, clean floors and surfaces. The 2 baskets of washing she'd left to fold on the dining room table were gone. There were no dirty dishes in the sink, no socks in the hall. It was then she noticed an aroma she hadn't smelled since before her mother had been diagnosed with cancer. Cassie's famous lasagna, a dish Faith had never been able to bring herself to cook. "Dad? Ryan?" she called through the house, which appeared deserted. A flush sounded from the bathroom, and moments later Ryan appeared. He rushed forward and enveloped her in a hug. "Welcome back, sis. Let me get you a drink." "Where's Dad?" "Gone to bed early. Reckons he had a headache." Faith raised her eyebrows. She looked slowly around, wondering whether all the mess was stuffed into cupboards or under beds somewhere. But she held her tongue, not wanting to discourage Ryan's new helpfulness. After checking the progress of dinner in the oven, her brother poured wine into 2 glasses. Even as she watched him do it, she was so stunned she didn't register what he was actually doing. Yet when he crossed the kitchen and offered her a glass, she got a whiff of the fruity aroma and almost retched. She pressed a hand against her stomach and shook her head. "No, thanks." After last night, she wasn't sure she could ever drink a drop of alcohol again. Ryan grinned. "Big night, hey?" "You have no idea." She hadn't meant to groan at the recollection, but couldn't help it. "And anyway," she said, before he started asking questions she didn't want to answer, "since when have you drunk wine?" He shrugged and looked a little cagey. "Since forever." "Okay, then." Everything in the world seemed a little crazy today. She sank into a chair and gestured to the oven. "Does that taste as good as it smells?" Ryan shrugged. "Dunno. I was waiting for my guinea pig to return." He grabbed a couple of tea towels to protect his hands and turned to the oven to take out his culinary efforts. Faith glanced at the oven mitts hanging on a hook on the wall, but couldn't summon the energy to direct him to them. She stared longingly at the glass of wine. If it had been a beer, she might have overlooked her heavy stomach and downed it, just for the relaxing effect. "Are you okay?" She looked up to see Ryan staring at her, and for 1 second contemplated telling him everything. She swallowed the urge because, although Ryan was her brother and loved her in his way, he'd no doubt find the idea of Faith and Monty loose between the sheets a ripper of a yarn to share at the pub. And it might have been funny if it had been just that, but the more she pondered what they'd done, the more she knew it was anything but. Never in her life had she wished more that her mother was still around. "I'm fine, just tired. And hungry. How long are you going to make me wait?" "Anyone ever tell you how bossy you can be?" Ryan asked, but he was smiling as he dished up the lasagna. "This is amazing," Faith said a couple of minutes later, after finishing her first mouthful. "Who'd have known you were such a good cook?" He shrugged, then grinned, obviously pleased by her compliment. "And I'm guessing you're responsible for the clean house and non-existent washing pile." "Guilty as charged," he said, digging into his dinner. "All your talk of changing and standing up for yourself has made me start thinking about my own life. I realised you were right. Lots of things need to change around here." At least I know you and Dad won't starve to death if I get work elsewhere." "Do you really think you might do that?" "Yep." After what had happened with Monty, she was in even less of a mood to keep ignoring her own dreams. She might not be able to make him see her as a woman. If what they'd done in the tent last night hadn't done the trick, nothing would. But she could start being more proactive about other areas of her life. "I'm going to start looking straight after the barking ball. In the unlikely event that Dad changes his tune before then, I might reconsider, but I'm not holding my breath." "I understand, but I really hope we can work something out." Ryan put his fork down. "I'd miss you." You'd miss having someone around to sort your socks and teas. He shook his head. I could get a wife if that was all I wanted. She smiled. Don't let the girls around here hear you talking like that. They might stop falling all over themselves to get you into bed with them. No great loss. It was her turn to rest her fork on her plate. I don't understand you, big brother. You're 31, you've had plenty of years sowing your wild oats. You could have the pick of young women in this district, and they're not all bad. What is it you want out of life? That's $1 million question, isn't it, Faith? This is the end of CD 4. The book continues on CD 5. CD 5. Chapter 15. It looks like the purchase is going ahead, Monty said, leaning against the fence as he delivered his news to Ruby. That's such fabulous news. She turned away from the horse she'd been grooming and grinned. I couldn't be happier for you. Thanks. After days of emails and faxes going back and forth to work out logistics, he was now waiting for the big one from Mac, the contract to buy Clancy's breakaway. In the end, Tim and Nora had offered vendor finance. Mac had explained this meant Monty's loan from the bank would pay what he could, and the Pattersons would provide the rest of the money as an interest-free loan. It sounded too good to be true. But having met the couple and spent 2 inspiring days in their company, he was confident this was the real deal. All told, he should have been feeling a lot happier than he was. He had work lined up for the 6 weeks until the settlement on Clancy's breakaway was complete. The lease on his rental had a few months to go, but the landlord had agreed to let him out of the contract early. And he'd been out with Ruby 2 nights out of the last 4. Although they hadn't kissed properly since the first date, it was only a matter of time, and he couldn't have asked her to be more enthusiastic about the farm. She'd listened intently as he went over every single detail about the property and his plans for it. Really, he was one lucky bugger. Yet despite all this, he had to force his smile at Ruby's enthusiasm. Maybe it was the guilt that gnawed at him over what he'd done with Faith. He'd conveniently left that little detail out of their discussions about his trip, not knowing how to bring it up without ruining things with Ruby. Yet the longer he didn't say anything, the more it felt as if he were walking around with bricks inside him. I should make you dinner to celebrate, she suggested, offering her horse a carrot as a reward for good behaviour throughout the grooming. Thankfully, she was looking at the horse and couldn't read the anxiety in his face. That would be great, he said, trying to sound enthusiastic, when all he could think about was the fact that he'd betrayed her. What's your favourite dish? You mean aside from macaroni cheese? She raised one eyebrow and laughed. I'll cook that if you want me to. Surprised me, he said, loosening up at the easy banter. Okay. But she sounded a little uncertain as she hauled herself over the fence. I'm working this afternoon, so how about I come round to your place about 6? I'll bring the ingredients. Sounds good. How could he not smile at the idea of a beautiful woman cooking for him in his kitchen? Today she looked sensational in fitted riding pants, a polo-necked pale blue shirt, and a sexy blush that crept right up her neck and bloomed in her soft cheeks. Would he ruin whatever was between them if he told her about Faith? His gut ached at the quandary. He wasn't the type of bloke to mess around on a woman, and he knew that if he didn't tell her he'd be lying by omission. But technically they weren't officially together when it happened. And anyway, the thing with Faith was a one-off, a crazy, drunken one-off that hopefully hadn't ruined the best friendship he'd ever had. I'll buy some wine, he said, deciding that for now at least, omission was the kindest option, red or white. I'm not sure I should tell you. She flicked her long hair behind her shoulders and grinned. You wouldn't give me a hint about the food. Fine, I'll buy one of each. He glanced at his watch. I'd better go. Mac's faxing the contract to the library any time now. See you later. She wiggled her fingers in a wave, and he thought about kissing her goodbye, but couldn't quite bring himself to do it. The Joneses' small acre property was only 2 minutes from town, so it didn't take long to reach the main street. It was Wednesday, and although midweek usually saw fewer people in town, it appeared today was the exception. Somehow he scored a parking space right outside the library building. He spotted Faith's four-wheel drive a couple of cars along and wondered what she was doing in town. They'd spoken a few times since that fateful night, but not seen each other. As promised, he'd kept her updated with news of the purchase, which was good because it had given them something to focus on aside from the other thing. He thought they'd done a great job of ignoring it, but now for some reason he was nervous about running into her. Slamming his door shut, he strode down the pavement. "Morning, Mandy." He nodded at a local farmer and her 3 kids under school age who were squabbling at her feet. "Nice day." "You reckon?" But she grinned at him as she scooped up the youngest, who'd found something to nibble off the pavement. "Heard you good news. Couldn't have happened to a nicer bloke." "Thanks." He picked up a plastic toy phone that one of the kids had dropped and handed it to her before continuing on his way. As was the way in small country towns, he stopped to talk with 3 other people before making it inside the building. Mrs. O'Neill sat behind the desk, squinting at something on the computer. A determined old woman, she refused to wear glasses, even though everyone could see she was half blind. She looked up and beamed at him. "Hi, Monty. Put the kettle on, Cara," she ordered the younger woman who worked there part-time, before turning back to him. "We've got your facts, and I've made some scones to celebrate with." "Scones and tea? Can I be in that?" Monty's heart hitched another beat, and he turned at the familiar voice. He found himself staring at Faith in the doorway behind him. Even in faded, torn-at-the-knee jeans and an old shearing singlet left over from her uni rousing days, she looked as edible as her famous caramel slice. "Of course you can," Mrs. O'Neill chirped. "The more the merrier." She went to fetch the facts and the scones, leaving Monty and Faith on their own. He swallowed, his mouth parched and desperate for that drink. "Hey, Faith." He hoped he didn't sound as weird as he felt. "Is that fax what I think it is?" she asked, dropping her keys and phone on the counter. She didn't quite look him in the eye. "Uh-huh." Inside, he grinned, but the awkwardness between them made him hesitant. "Want to be my witness?" She bit her lower lip before speaking. "Do you think I should? Tim and Nora think we're... it might be better if they don't recognize the name. I'm certain Mrs. O'Neill would love to do the honours." "Yeah, you're right." At her reference to their time away, his blood heated. "So, what brings you in here?" he asked, as much to distract himself as anything. "I need to use the photocopier to print off the tickets for the ball." She pulled a folder out of her bag and then held up an A4 sheet with 10 tickets on it. "Things are really taking off now. We've already had loads of interest, so I've decided to put them on sale early." "Very exciting, isn't it, Monty?" Mrs. O'Neill called from the back of the room. "I've marked the night in my calendar." Her eyes might have been failing her, but those ears were supersonic. "I'll be expecting a dance with you." He and Faith laughed. "And by the way, Faith, those books you ordered arrived this morning. I'll get them for you in a moment." "Thanks," Faith called back. Mrs. O'Neill returned to the desk, waved a bunch of papers in the air, and then handed them to Monty. "These are what you've been waiting for." She rummaged in a box labelled Pre-Ordered Books and passed a small pile to Faith. "And these are for you." Faith glanced down at the pile. Actually, they're for Monty. He looked up from where he'd been checking over the contract. "There are a bunch of books on cattle farming," she explained, still not quite meeting his gaze. "I asked Mrs. O'Neill to order them in last week, the day Mac told you about the property." "They came quickly," Mrs. O'Neill added. A lump formed in Monty's throat at the gesture. Typical Faith, always thinking of other people, doing things to make them feel like the most important person in the world. Had he always taken her for granted? She misread his silence and dumped the books back on the desk. "If you don't want them, Mrs. O'Neill can send them back." He snatched them up and then pulled her into a hug. "I do, thank you." The scent of her shampoo wafted up into his nostrils as her silky hair slid against his cheek. He ignored the physical reaction that welled up deep inside him. "I'll read every single one." The hug lasted a little longer than normal, and finally Mrs. O'Neill cleared her throat. "Are we going to sign these papers or are we not?" Faith extracted herself. "Go on. This is what you've worked so hard towards. They crossed to a vacant table in the non-fiction section. Monty spread the paperwork out in front of him and quickly finished scanning the information to ensure it was as Mac had discussed. Satisfied everything was in order, he picked up the pen Kara had delivered and leaned over to sign his life away. Mrs. O'Neill happily played witness, then they all got stuck into the tea and scones. "We're going to miss you here," Mrs. O'Neill said with a sniff. Kara snorted. "Yeah, who else will fix your house up at the drop of a hat?" "I promise I'll check everything is in order before I leave." Monty offered the older woman a smile. He'd miss her Anzac biscuits almost as much as she'd miss his hammer. As Kara cleared away the mess and Mrs. O'Neill tottered off to check a book out for someone, Faith wiped a little cream off her lip and asked, "So are we going out to celebrate?" "Maybe tomorrow night or Friday." Her face fell. "You already have plans tonight?" He nodded, hating to disappoint her. "Ruby's making dinner." Why was that simple statement so damn hard to get out? "Great." He could tell her smile was forced. "Are you going to take her down to see Clancy's breakaway soon?" "We haven't discussed it yet. It's just early days." Talking about Ruby with Faith still felt awkward. "Besides, I'm going to be pretty busy up until settlement, what with seeding at Adam's place and everything." "Of course." Once, Faith would have asked him about the plans for seeding, and if there was anything she could do to help, but instead another horrible silence descended between them. There was nothing he hated more than standing next to Faith, racking his brain and being unable to think of one thing to say. He gathered up his papers. "Well, I'd better get these faxed back to Mac." "Yes. Congrats again." Faith smiled. "Call me if you want to get the gang together on Friday." Monty watched as Faith farewelled Kara and Mrs. O'Neill. He couldn't tear his eyes away as she opened the door and headed out onto the street. He kept looking through the window as she jogged down the pavement and climbed up into her four-wheel drive. The tension between them made his chest ache, but he didn't have a clue how to fix it. Chapter 16. On Friday night, Faith feigned a headache. The emotional rollercoaster of the last few days had more than taken its toll. She'd self-prescribed lots of baking and early nights, and even bought a natural calming tablet from the chemist. Anything for some quality sleep in which she didn't toss and turn thinking about Monty. Much to her surprise and relief, the torrid dreams had ceased. During the day, she often thought of that night in the tent, but at night she merely lamented her lost friendship. No matter how often Monty insisted they could remain friends, she couldn't see a way to make it work. "You're not coming into town?" Ryan asked as he entered the kitchen, where Faith was loading her baking efforts into containers for the freezer. He nabbed a square of caramel slice and shoved it in his mouth. "Nah, got a bit of a headache." "What about Monty's big celebration? He'll miss you." "I guess." Although she wasn't so sure. He'd text-messaged her with the details the day before. Texted. He couldn't even make the effort to call. "I celebrated with him when we went to see his new farm." Boy, oh boy, had they celebrated. "Suit yourself." Ryan stole another piece and surveyed the full containers littering the kitchen bench. "You've gone above and beyond with this year's seeding cooking. Is that so Dad will have no excuse not to give you a turn on the tractor?" Ironically, that hadn't even crossed her mind. The conversations with her father were still few and far between, but she'd barely spent a moment worrying about him or the farm since returning from down south. Something like that. "You have a good night." She wanted Ryan to take his good mood elsewhere so she could get back to wallowing. This would likely be his last night out for a while. The weatherman had predicted rain in the next week, and that meant all the local farmers would soon be glued to tractors and burning the candle at both ends. "Will do." Ryan doffed an imaginary hat and all but swaggered out of the house. Faith continued boxing up her cakes and slices, keeping one ear on the ABC News her father was watching in the other room. She piled all the plastic containers into a big cardboard box and took it out to the spare freezer on the back veranda. Returning to the house, she peeped into the lounge room and saw her dad, leaning back in his armchair, his feet on the coffee table and a travel brochure in his hands. She watched him for a few moments, wishing the television was off so she could see his expression reflected in the glass. He'd been so sad, so angry, so different since her mother had died. She hoped he'd find something in those mags to snag his interest. When she could hold back no longer, she tiptoed into the room and slid onto the couch, glancing surreptitiously at the brochure in his hands. Tibet looked to be the country of choice. His voice seemed to come from nowhere. "I suppose these are yours?" He didn't even bother to look at her. Undeterred, she forced a smile. "I got them for you, actually, Dad. You and Mum used to talk about travelling one day. Anything there spark your interest?" In reply, he hurled the brochure across the room, missing the wastepaper bin and knocking an ornament off the mantelpiece. The statue, an ugly ceramic emu given to Ryan by one of his many admirers, smashed on the floor. Silence filled the room. "You might have time to waltz around the countryside organising fancy fundraisers, going away with your friends and travelling the world, but some of us are too busy for that." He huffed and folded his arms. "Some of us have to earn the money to put bread on the table." She stared at the broken pieces on the floor, her jaw locking in place. She couldn't stand it anymore. Couldn't stand him. "And whose fault is that, Daddy? If you would just let me help around here, maybe you wouldn't have to work so hard," she shouted. Then, in much the same manner as he'd hurled the brochure across the room, she stood and hurled herself out of it. So much for things improving between them. She stormed into her bedroom, slammed the door, and had only just collapsed onto the bed when her phone started ringing. Thinking it was probably Monty wondering where she was, she checked the caller ID. Jenny Montgomery. Part of her longed to talk to her friend, but she also worried that Monty's mum would hear the sadness and anger in her voice, and would then wheedle things out of her that she didn't want to share. After taking a deep breath, Faith cleared her throat and pressed answer. "Hi, Jenny." "Hello, love. Sorry to bother you tonight. Are you already in town? It's so exciting, isn't it? My boy finally buying his own place. You must be looking forward to a big night." "No." Faith adjusted the pillows behind her and tried to find comfort under her doona. "I gave it a miss." "Are you not well?" Concern radiated from Jenny's voice. "I'm fine." Faith rushed to allay the other woman's worries. "I'm simply exhausted with everything that's been happening lately and swamped with organisation for the ball." "Oh, that's why I'm calling," Jenny said. "I've got some friends heading up with us for the weekend and we're all incredibly excited, but I've also been thinking about what I can do to help from down here. You don't have to do anything. Coming and bringing extras is more than enough. But I want to. I know you were doing this for Will as much as for yourself, and I appreciate the tribute. I'd like to help raise some money, and I wondered how you'd feel about me setting up a flower essence stall." Faith wondered if anyone up here would even know what flower essences were. She knew a little about flower material used in natural remedies, but only because whenever Jenny discovered a new passion, she tended to be so excited that everyone around her heard about it too. Jenny laughed. "Lots of people are very interested in the benefits of essences, you know. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. I thought I could donate all the money raised to the ball, and I've got a couple of friends who would be happy to donate their services too. Between us, we can do essences, tea leaf reading, palm reading, and fortune-telling by the cards. Please say yes." Faith hesitated another moment, but then thought, why not? Who was she to turn down any extra ways of raising funds? "How could I not? It actually sounds like a great idea." After a few drinks, people would likely be flocking to have their fortunes told. "Fabulous. Well, I'll let you get to bed, but promise you'll call if there's any other way I can help." "I will." "And speaking of Will, how is he?" "Oh, he's great." Faith could hear the smile in Jenny's voice. "He's loving his new job, and this lady friend is becoming quite a feature in his life too. He wants to bring her to the ball." "That's the best news I've heard in ages." "Isn't it just? And give that other boy of mine a hug for me next time you see him. I don't think we'll get up there before the barking ball now." "Sure," Faith lied. The truth was, she could barely handle being in Monty's company right now, and she definitely couldn't trust herself to hug him. Taking another sip of his beer, Monty turned his head at the sound of the door opening. When the silhouette of a burly farm worker solidified into a man he'd worked alongside a few times, a claw of disappointment wrapped itself around his heart. This was supposed to be a happy night, but getting in the celebratory mood was hard without Faith's smiling face to cheer him on. She'd been there for every other momentous occasion in his life. Why couldn't she just move on like he was trying so damn hard to do? He glanced at his watch and took another slug as Ruby returned from the ladies. Swallowing, he forced a smile onto his face, not wanting his foul mood to sour his time with Ruby. "Can I get you another drink?" he asked as she sat on the seat beside him. "Thanks. A white wine, please." Downing the last drops of his beer, he stood and headed for the bar. While waiting to place an order, he glanced back to the table where Ruby sat with Adam, a few of his other mates, and Ryan Forrester. Ryan arriving and announcing Faith had a headache and couldn't make it had been a real kick to the balls, but he hoped no one had noticed his disappointment. Chapter 17. Over the next few weeks, the town of Bunyip Bay was in full swing, seeding mode. Except for Faith and her small committee, who were busy with the barking ball, precious little else was on anyone's mind. For once, she didn't mind not being allowed to help with the seeding at Forrester's Rock. In fact, she didn't know how she would have fitted in. Rain fell hard and fast from the sky, which meant farmers remained at work on their properties, and their wives and girlfriends ventured into town only rarely to top up with supplies. Hard-working Monty was a sought-after commodity, and Faith had seen little of him. He'd popped into one committee meeting and updated them on his progress organising transport to and from Geraldton, but other than that, he'd been glued to a tractor. According to Ruby, who sat across the table from Faith now as they waited for Simone to join them, she'd seen very little of him either. Faith found some satisfaction in this fact. Frankie, the cafe owner, who also happened to be Simone's sister, brought over a hot chocolate for Faith, a green tea for Ruby, and the latte they'd ordered for Simone. "Sure I can't get you a slice of something as well?" she asked, glancing at the cakes sitting on the front bench. "I'm going to have to throw them out if they don't get eaten today. Such a waste." Throughout seeding and harvest, Bunyip Bay was like a ghost town, and local businesses always suffered. No one seemed to remember that if the farmers had a good season, towny business would boom for the rest of the year. The way Faith saw it, this awesome wet start to the season meant that hopefully the farmers, most of whom had already booked their tickets for the ball, would be happy post-seeding and generous with their donations on the night. "Oh, go on," Faith pointed at the caramel mud cake. "You twisted my arm." Although she still had a freezer overflowing with sweet treats at home, food had been one of her few solaces lately, and Lord knew it always tasted better when somebody else was doing the cooking. "Shall I get a slice for you as well?" Frankie looked to Ruby. "No thanks," she replied. Faith noticed a contented glow in Ruby's face that hadn't been there last time she'd seen her. Was Monty responsible for it? Her heart clenched at the thought. As Frankie turned to fetch the cake, Faith tried not to look obvious about scrutinising Ruby's face for signs. She'd said she'd barely seen Monty, but that indicated that she had seen some of him. Logic told her that if Ruby and Monty had been officially seeing each other since that night in Geraldton, they'd more than likely have slept together by now. Suddenly she didn't think she could eat a mouthful of cake, no matter how good it might taste. The cafe door opened, and Simone rushed in looking frenzied. "Kids, don't have 'em," she announced as she dumped her oversized handbag on the floor and slumped into a chair. "Sorry I'm late. Harriet decided she didn't want to go to school, and she's such a conniving little thing I almost gave in, but then Grace said she didn't want to go either. They are both perfectly well, so no way was I going to have them squabbling around me all day." She spied the latte and grinned as she lifted it to her lips. She took a sip, sighed, then added, "Thanks for this. You gals are the best. Now what did I miss?" "Nothing yet," Faith answered, trying to banish the image of Ruby and Monty in bed from her mind. The jealousy was eating her up. Every time Faith looked at Ruby, she thought about admitting what she and Monty had gotten up to down south. It wasn't guilt that made Faith want to confess, but rather the hope that doing so would cause an irreparable rift between the lovebirds. That night with Monty had meant everything to her. and his ability to simply dismiss it and continue seeing Ruby was breaking her heart. "Oh, good." Simone took another long, satisfied sip, and then dug into her handbag for a notebook and pen. That was Faith's signal to stop obsessing over Ruby. She opened her clipboard and glanced down at the spreadsheet timeline that had become their Bible. If anyone found it, they could be forgiven for thinking it was trash, so prolific were the annotations, red pen lines and highlighted sections. But it held the key to everything that would make their fundraiser the best. "Okay, let's go through the checklist," Faith said. "Then you can both fill me in on where you're at." "You go first." Simone glanced at Ruby, who'd taken control of sourcing quotes from caterers. "I need another coffee before I'm ready." "Okay." Ruby smiled and switched on the iPad, where she kept all her notes, and a calendar that looked far more organised than Faith's paper one. "I've received quotes from 2 catering companies in Perth and 1 from Geraldton. Frankie decided against putting in a proposal as she wants to attend the ball." "Sorry, Faith," Frankie piped up from behind the counter, "but I'm desperate for a good night out." "You're just desperate," Simone retorted. Frankie poked out her tongue. "Don't come crawling to me next time you need babysitting. Like you my girls think they're too old for babysitters now." "Anyway," Ruby said, loud enough to draw everyone's attention back to the task at hand. She pulled 2 sheets of paper from a cardboard folder and handed one each to Faith and Simone. "I think we should go with this company. They suggest a buffet, which means guests will have a greater choice, and they also happen to be 10% cheaper." As food and beverages would be their biggest expense, any kind of discount appealed. "Do we know if they're any good?" Faith asked. "They've provided references from 5 other functions they've recently catered of a similar size and tone to ours." Ruby took another piece of paper from her folder. "But even better is the option for us to head into Geraldton and have a taste test." "I'm in," Simone grinned. "Never turn down free food is one of my mottos to live by." "Mine too. You've made amazing progress, Ruby," Faith admitted reluctantly. "Thank you." "My pleasure. I've also spoken to Louis at the liquor store. You're going to love this." She paused for effect, which only irritated Faith more. "He's willing to supply all the alcohol at cost price." "What the? How the hell did you manage that?" Simone voiced Faith's thoughts. Ruby smiled. "It was easy. When I told him it was to help Faith raise money for her alumni contest, he couldn't offer a discount fast enough. I think you've got quite a fan there, Faith." Rumour was Louis had a thing for my mum before she married Dad. He's always been sweet to me, but I never thought he'd be that generous. "Man," Simone wriggled her eyebrows in excitement. "This is going to put us way ahead of budget." "I know." Faith felt her heart warm a smidgen towards Ruby. "I don't know how I can thank you enough." "Don't be silly, it's all for a good cause." She crossed catering update off her meeting checklist and then looked to Simone. "So how are you going with the PR?" "Fabulously. I've had an awesome response from the press release." She opened her notebook in the middle and angled it towards Faith. "I've got 3 radio interviews lined up for you and 5 journalists who want to write a story. All promised to run their articles before our ticket deadline." "Wow, that's brilliant." Simone held up her hand. "But wait, there's more. I've spoken to the party hire and supply shop in Geraldton, and they're willing to offer a small discount too. I've put in an initial rough order for the tables, chairs and crockery beyond what the Shire owns, and they've sent us a brochure to help us choose the decorations." She opened an A4-sized glossy catalogue. They all leaned into the table to take a look. Faith's eyebrows rose at the prices next to the products. "Geez, not cheap, is it?" "No, which is why I've had a better idea," Simone said. She snapped the brochure shut and dumped it on the floor near her bag. "Harriet's home economics class are looking to do a community-focused project, so I asked their teacher if they'd be interested in making the decorations. They've only got a month, so it's a massive job, but guess who just happened to volunteer to help?" "Who?" Faith and Ruby asked in unison. "The blessed CWA!" Who else? Faith was speechless. Everyone knew the old dears of the Country Women's Association could achieve anything once they put their minds to it. But it wasn't just the CWA ladies. Whether it was donating to the auction, volunteering to wait and clear tables on the night, assisting with the setup and clean-up duties, or just buying tickets and promising to spend big at the event, pretty much everyone in Bunyip Bay had stepped up to Faith's challenge. How many other entrants in the Ms. Alumna of the Year award would have a whole town behind them? "That sounds beyond awesome," Faith managed, hoping her voice didn't sound too shaky as she struggled to contain her emotion. "And have you told them what we want the decorations to include?" Simone nodded. "I've given them our paw print design and colour scheme. I'm waiting on the go-ahead from you, but if Harriet's enthusiasm is anything to go by, they'll do a fabulous job." Back at their first meeting, Faith had told Simone she wanted a puppy paw print theme over everything, and Simone had created a cute little rustic red and chocolate brown paw logo for the event. The Dogs for Autism logo also had a prime spot on all their printed material, but the red and brown paw print had springboarded the rest of the colour scheme. "Excellent." Faith consulted her agenda. "Well, I guess that leaves me." She spent the next half an hour telling Ruby and Simone about all the donations they'd received so far and the organisations who'd signed up to sponsor the event. After that, the trio made notes on what needed to be done between now and their next meeting, and, happy it was all coming together, they finished with a lunch of BLTs and a side of fries. Chapter 18. The thing about seeding was, it involved long, solitary hours on a tractor and lots of time to think. Many men liked the quiet time, but Monty found it tedious. For years he'd sat in the hot spot, driving back and forth up other people's paddocks, dreaming of the day he'd be toiling on his own land. Now, with the days ticking down until he took over Clancy's breakaway, that dream was no longer pie-in-the-sky stuff. He should have been whiling away these hours making concrete plans. Instead, all he could think about was Faith. He missed her, damn it. He missed her smile, her easygoing attitude, her support, and her enthusiasm for his dreams. He missed hanging out. Approaching the boundary of the paddock, Monty tried to push his frustration aside as he slowed the tractor, ready to turn around. Dusk had almost faded to darkness now, and the headlights of the tractor shone bright ahead. He'd go at it another few hours, then head back into town for a quick kip before starting again at first light. Making time to go and visit Faith, to have it out with her, was near on impossible during seeding, but he couldn't leave Bunyip Bay with things so strained between them. Once his work commitments were over in another week or two, he'd clear his schedule to help her with the barking ball. Spending time apart hadn't helped, so maybe working together would give things the chance to get back to normal. Feeling slightly better at having formulated a plan, he turned the tractor and began the slow crawl towards the other end of the paddock. Halfway across, his phone rang. For a second, his heart jolted in the hope that it might be Faith, but the caller ID showed Ruby. He smiled as he answered. "Hi there." "Hi yourself. How are things out at Annandale?" "Yeah, great. We should be all finished here soon." "That's fabulous. Are you planning a late one tonight, or can I lure you away with the offer to cook?" As if on cue, his stomach rumbled. He hadn't had a decent meal since Ruby had cooked for him last week. Adam's mum, Esther, attempted to feed the workers, but her culinary efforts extended to watery stews for lunch and dry, crumbly scones for Smoko. He'd taken to cooking up packets of 2-minute noodles when he arrived home late at night, not that they came close to filling the hole. Oh, how he missed Faith's incredible cakes and slices. "Give me another hour and I'm all yours." "I like the sound of that." As he disconnected, he wondered if he'd read the suggestive tone into Ruby's last line. Was she expecting them to take things further tonight? In a way, he wished it were that. He'd asked her to be his date for the barking ball, and even during seeding he'd seen her an average of 2 nights a week. Any court of law would class them as dating. Yet he still had this ridiculous paranoia about kissing her again, so he hadn't even tried. Ugh! Monty let out a loud groan that only the dirt and distant trees could hear. On autopilot, he finished the paddock, parked the tractor, and radioed to tell Adam he was calling it a night. He arrived home to find Ruby already sitting on the front step, 2 bulging plastic bags at her feet. As usual, she was slightly overdressed, in glossy trousers and a chiffon blouse. Her dark hair, so straight and shiny, made her look like she'd just stepped out of a salon. "You're early," he called, beeping his ute locked as he jogged towards the house. He rarely used to bother, but recently there'd been a spate of petty crime in town. A couple of cars had been stolen, and some at the local junkyard torched, But the local sergeant, due for retirement any day, appeared to be more interested in his golf handicap than anything else. "I didn't mind waiting. It's a beautiful night." Ruby rose and picked up the bags. "Thanks for coming around." He leaned forward and kissed her on the cheek. Damn it, no sparks, but it was only a peck. "I wanted to." She stepped aside while he unlocked the door. Then he took the bags and ushered her inside. He flicked the lights on in the kitchen, dumped the bags on the bench, and gestured to the fridge. "I need to have a shower. Can I get you a drink before I go?" "No, I'll be fine." She stepped up to the bench and opened the first bag. "I'll get started, and we can have a drink when you're finished." "Thanks." Longing for a hot shower to wash away the tension of being cooped up on a tractor all day, he was already heading down the hallway. He smiled as he kicked the bathroom door shut behind him and stripped naked. It felt so domestic arriving home to Ruby, knowing she was pottering around his kitchen while he cleaned up. As he stood under the hot shards of water, he tried to picture her in the kitchen at Clancy's breakaway, tried to imagine them sitting down in the lounge room together after a long day's work. But frustratingly, all he could visualize was the tent. And Faith. His body grew immediately hard at the thought. Not good when he had a totally different woman waiting in his kitchen. Cursing under his breath, he leaned his head against the tiles and waited for their coldness to seep through into his body. Just when the one thing he'd always dreamed of had finally clicked into place, everything else seemed to be going crazy, and he had no idea how to deal with it. "We can't go on like this. I have to tell her." That sobering thought returned his body to a state fit to leave the bathroom. He scrubbed dry and dressed quickly in jeans and a rugby jumper before heading back to the kitchen. He'd been gone longer than he'd expected, and Ruby had already laid the table. Dinner of Chinese stir-fried veg and noodles was nearly ready. "Now can I get you that drink?" he asked, his mouth watering at the thought of that first thirst-quenching mouthful of beer. "Wine, beer, juice?" "I'll have a white wine, thanks, but just the one. I don't want the new cop stopping me on my way home." Monty took a bottle of beer and one of wine from the fridge. "I didn't think he'd started yet," he said, uncorking the wine and pouring her a glass. "About time, though." "He arrived the other day." Her smile begged for further questioning. Taking his beer, he sat down at the table. "What's everyone saying?" She tossed the noodles through her stir-fry as she spoke. "Apparently he's English. Drew something. About 30, tall, dark, rides a motorbike. But the big news is he's already pulled in 2 local teenagers about the torched cars." "Geez, watch out, Sergeant O'Leary," he chuckled. "How do you know all this stuff?" She laughed as she placed 2 bowls on the small table. "I hear things at the store. And remember, I haven't been locked away on a tractor for the past 2 weeks. She paused for a second and then pointed at his noodles. "You dig in. I'm just going to clean up a bit." "No, leave it till we're finished," he said. "Better still, leave it completely. I'll do it in the morning." "Don't be silly. You'll be back out on the tractor first thing tomorrow morning, and who knows how long this mess will be here." He glanced past her to the so-called mess and frowned. Apart from the wok with the leftover noodles still on the stove, his kitchen barely looked as if it had been used. When Faith made dinner, she used every pot and pan in the joint and left the cleaning up as long as possible, whereas Ruby's cooking style was immaculate. "Please leave it." Desperate to put her at ease, Monty stood and crossed to where she was already wiping up around the hot plate. "There's barely anything to clean anyway. Sit down. I won't be able to relax if you don't." She sighed deeply, pursed her lips, and glanced longingly at the few splashes of sauce on his bench. "Okay, let's eat." They returned to the table and sat. "This is amazing," he said after swallowing the first mouthful. "Better than the Chinese restaurant in Geraldton." She laughed. "That's probably just because you're starving after working so hard." "No, this is really good. Did someone teach you to cook like this?" She glanced down at her plate, swirled some noodles on her fork. "I taught myself. I've read a lot of cookbooks. Anyway," she began what was clearly a change of subject. "How are you going out on the farm?" He wondered why she didn't want to talk about her skill at cooking, but let it slide. "Great, we should be finished soon." He took another few mouthfuls, then said, "By the way, I looked in at the cottage now Mrs. Burton started decorating. She's doing a good job. Your ideas there were spot on. She shrugged it off.
It was a fun project, just something to keep me busy.
And now you've got the barking ball? He hadn't meant to mention the committee or Faith, but he couldn't help himself.
Yes, it's going to be a fabulous night, don't you think?
Ruby smiled.
Faith's doing such an amazing job.
Are you two getting close then?
Ruby half laughed. I wouldn't say close. I still get the feeling she'd sometimes rather I wasn't involved. I'm not sure what I've done to make her dislike me.
Her questioning stare seemed to burn holes in his skin. Had Faith said something? Or was he reading too much into Ruby's expression? He shouldn't have left it this long to confess. Amidst these worrying thoughts, Ruby asked,
Have you two had a fight or something?
No. Well, not exactly. It was all he could manage past the dry lump that felt like a sock shoved down the back of his throat.
Because I'd hate to think I'd come between you. Faith told Frankie she hadn't seen or spoken much to you lately.
It's the time of year. We've both been busy. He tried for a shrug as he took a slug of beer, but Ruby raised her eyebrows, telling him he wasn't going to get away with leaving it at that.
It was more than that. Every time I mention you, she freezes up. And you're the same. What's going on, Monty?
You could have heard ants shifting crumbs under the floorboards. Ruby's gaze didn't waver as she waited for him to speak. Using the beer as a crutch, he drank slowly this time, all the while wondering just what and how much to confess. Finally, he sighed, put his bottle on the table, and looked her straight in the eye. You know when we went down south together? It was a rhetorical question, but she nodded. The current owners of the farm assumed Faith was my girlfriend, and they liked the idea that a couple were looking to buy their property. When we realised this, I asked Faith to help me by playing along with it. So far, so good. He picked up the bottle again and tore at the label as he continued. Well, things got a little heated. We might have got a bit carried away.
Oh.
Ruby reached for her wine glass.
How carried away?
There was no kind way to put it. We got sloshed and slept together. He hated himself for these words, hated the way she took a slug of wine as if she needed it to wash over the pain he'd caused her with his statement. He wanted to defend himself, to convince her that he wasn't that kind of guy. Never in his life had he even contemplated cheating on a girlfriend. Ruby looked at the curtains.
Oh. Well.
She smiled, but it was clearly forced.
I guess we never agreed to exclusivity or anything.
No, Monty all but shouted. That's not true. When I asked you out, I didn't just mean for a night. I hoped that it would turn into something long-term. I really like you and... I'm sorry, Ruby. I know I should have told you when it happened, but I just couldn't. I'm so sorry. She sniffed.
So am I. I feel silly coming here, making you a meal, thinking that you were interested in me.
He reached across the table to take her hand, but she pulled it back. Please don't feel like that, he said. I'm the idiot. I've liked you since the moment I saw you, and what do I go and do? Completely stuff it up. Silence reigned for a few long moments, and Monty, encouraged by the fact she hadn't got up and fled, said, Have I stuffed it up? Will you give me a second chance? Ruby shook her head.
I can't. I left a messy relationship at the end of last year and came home looking for a fresh start. I've only just felt ready to date again, but if I'm going to even contemplate a relationship, I need to feel like that person is 100% committed. You may think we can move on from this, but I need more. I deserve it.
The disappointment he thought he'd feel at her rebuttal didn't come. All he could do was nod his head and offer another futile apology. You do. And I'm sorry I was just another loser that hurt you.
That's a little dramatic, she said. Look, we had a few good dates and it didn't work out, but I hope we can still be friends.
A different kind of relief flooded him. Really? I'd like that. She cut him off, lifting her hand.
Don't you dare say sorry again. There's only so much a girl can take.
He laughed. Okay, point taken. Although they tried to move on and continue normal conversation, the meal ended in relative silence, and Monty found himself relieved when Ruby got up to leave. It was over. Over before it had really begun. He felt wretched, the kind of man he'd never wanted to be. But staring at his beer bottle, he realised it was more due to the way he'd handled the situation and the hurt he'd caused Ruby than to any sense of loss. Some things just weren't meant to be. Chapter 19. Faith glared at the text message and cursed under her breath. She couldn't believe Simone had cancelled. Now she'd have to go to Geraldton to see the caterers alone with Ruby. Monty's love interest had been nothing but helpful since joining the committee, making it difficult for Faith to hold on to her assumptions about her. But how could they be friends when every bit of Faith's heart ached that Ruby was the one Monty wanted? She sighed at life's unfairness and tossed her phone into her bag on the driver's seat before putting her four-wheel drive into reverse. May as well get it over with. Just as her phone scraped the bottom of her cavernous bag, it started up again. Maybe Ruby couldn't come either. Not glancing at the caller ID, she almost gasped at the male voice on the other end of the line. "Hi, Faith." Her knees wobbled at the deep, sexy, and oh so familiar voice. It took a moment for her to collect her emotions and reply. "Hi, Monty." They'd barely spoken lately. He'd been too busy with seeding and Ruby, and now she wondered at the reason for the call. "Is something the matter?" "Only that I haven't seen my best girl for ages." Her heart swelled, but she told herself not to read anything into his words. He probably just wanted things back to normal, whatever normal was. She forced a laugh. "Ruby playing hard to get?" "I meant you, silly. I wanted to thank you for ordering those books for me. I've read them all cover to cover." "You're welcome." An uneasy silence lingered between them. She wanted to reach down the phone line and pull him to her. It was so obvious he was slowly slipping away, that what they'd done together had caused an irreparable rift. But she couldn't simply forget. Perhaps I should tell him how I feel. It couldn't make anything worse than it already was. "Monty, Faith! Faith!" A rapping on her window startled her. She glanced sideways to see her father's face, as red as if he'd just run the circumference of the farm. At first she thought he was angry, but his eyes looked more thoughtful than fuming. "I've got to go, Monty. Speak to you soon." Hoping her father was finally ready to talk, she disconnected, wound down her window, and pasted on an encouraging smile. "What's up, Dad?" "Well, I just wanted—" He let out an exasperated sigh, and then gestured at the shed in front of her. "I need to get your mum's car out, that's what, and you're blocking the way." Whatever she'd been expecting, it wasn't that. She raised her eyebrows as she tried to recall the last time anyone had driven her mother's vehicle. An unassuming, faded red Holden wagon. The rego had expired years ago, and it probably wouldn't even start. "Well, are you going to sit there all day, or are you going to move so I can get on with mine?" Faith's eyes prickled with tears at his angry tone, but she didn't want him to see how much he hurt her. She turned her gaze to the driveway behind her and revved her four-wheel drive. "I'm going." By the time she arrived in town, she'd almost forgotten why she'd come. All she could think about was how rapidly her life was going down the gurgler. Only as she zoomed past the ag store and saw Ruby waiting did she recall her purpose. Doing a U-turn, Faith pulled the car to the curb and couldn't help noticing how polished Ruby looked. Was there ever a day she couldn't get her hair and makeup just right? And what was with the flowers she always wore in her hair? Today's was a bright red gerbera that perfectly matched her latest fashion red jeans. The only jeans Faith ever wore were black or blue, but she had to admit on Ruby they worked. "Thanks for picking me up." Ruby slid into the car and offered Faith a tentative smile. Faith tried to return it, hoping Ruby wouldn't notice her red-rimmed eyes or tear-stained cheeks. The last thing she wanted was to discuss her woes with Little Miss Perfect. Ruby clicked her seatbelt in. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" she said, gesturing out the window to the sunny winter day. "Sure is," Faith managed through clenched teeth. Not wanting to dwell on what might be responsible for Ruby's chirpiness, she slammed her foot onto the accelerator and swerved the car back out onto the main street. Town was generally quiet at this time of the morning, but it was just her luck that a car happened to be coming in the other direction. She barely noticed it until suddenly a siren whooped and the blue and red lights on its roof flashed. Police. Faith's heart started pounding in her chest as she realised she'd been speeding. She immediately slowed the four-wheel drive, but the cop turned around and tailed her nonetheless. Damn it, could this day get any worse?
I think you ought to pull over,
Ruby said as she peered over the passenger seat. You think? Having vowed to try a little harder with Ruby, Faith swallowed the sarcastic response. I suppose so. She stopped the car, hoping her pursuer was Sergeant O'Leary, who likely couldn't be bothered with the hassle of writing up a ticket. No such luck. Looking in the rearview mirror, she saw a tall, dark-haired and commanding presence swaggering towards her. Morning, ladies, came the cop's clipped British accent as she wound down her window. His badge confirmed him to be the new constable, Drew Noble. Going a bit fast there. Sorry. No excuse? He raised his dark eyebrows. Faith opened her mouth, preparing to bombard him with excuses, but Ruby leaned across her before she had the chance to reply. She watched in horrified fascination as her passenger smiled, batted her incredibly long eyelashes, and looked up apologetically at the new cop. Sorry, Constable, it's probably my fault. Faith and I have a meeting in Geraldton and I slept in this morning, making us late. Faith's usually a very good driver. She hadn't known Ruby could be such a convincing liar. Is that so? He folded his arms, but looked to be battling a smile. Faith found herself nodding alongside Ruby. I'll need to see your license. While Faith dug it out of her purse, he asked, You girls from around here? Yes, they replied as one. He unfolded his arms and studied her license. After staring long enough to memorize her details, he said, All right then, and handed it back. Consider this a warning. I see you speeding again, Miss Forrester. Not only will I throw the book at you, I'll be watching your every move for as long as I'm in town. There's no room for shenanigans on the road. Understand? Feeling thoroughly put in her place, Faith nodded and let out a breath of relief as the policeman tipped his head, turned, and swaggered back to his vehicle. Geez, he can watch my every move whenever he likes. Faith turned to see Ruby fanning her face, which looked like she'd spent a few hours too long in the sun. It was the first time she'd seen this flirtatious side of Ruby, but that wasn't what bothered her. What about Monty? Ruby's smile dimmed. What about him? Faith raised her eyebrows, her heart stilling in her chest at Ruby's tone. She swallowed, but it didn't alleviate her discomfort. Had Monty told her about what they'd done? She decided to play it safe. I thought you guys were seeing each other. We had a couple of dates, Ruby replied, but it didn't work out. Faith felt as if she'd been holding her breath for weeks and could now breathe. Could she dare to hope Monty's thing with Ruby was over? If that were true... I'm so sorry was on the tip of her tongue, but she swallowed the lie. She desperately wanted to know why they had split, which one of them had ended things. But they weren't really friends, and so it wasn't appropriate to ask. In the end, she said, Monty's a good friend to have. Apparently. But before Faith could ask exactly what Ruby meant by that, the other woman changed the subject. I hope you didn't have a big breakfast. The caterers emailed me the list of what we're going to sample today. We might not have to eat for the next week. 3 hours later, Faith didn't think she'd be able to eat for the rest of the month, let alone the week. That was divine, Ruby said, as Faith leaned over to sign the contract appointing the caterers for the ball. Sure was. Faith grinned as she handed it back to the owner of the business. Somehow, over the last few hours, they'd settled into easy conversation. With the fun of tasting foods and selecting a menu, they'd decided against a buffet in the end. The tension between them had faded, and Faith had to admit, Ruby wasn't at all like she'd assumed. Although quiet and reserved in most ways, she had a sense of humour much like her own, and appeared genuinely enthusiastic about the ball. They thanked the caterers for a delicious lunch, promised to be in touch, and headed out onto the street. I reckon you stumbled on gold when you found these guys. I can barely walk. Faith laughed as they started towards the four-wheel drive. I know what you mean, Ruby rubbed her stomach. "I might have to buy a new dress for the big night. Lord knows if I'll fit into the one I planned to wear anymore." Faith froze, her keys slapping against her thigh as she halted mid-stride. She'd been so hung up on organising the actual event that the thought of what she'd wear had never even crossed her mind. "What's wrong?" Ruby asked. "I haven't got a dress yet." The confession embarrassed her, not only because it showed she wasn't as organised as she wanted everyone to believe, but because Ruby likely had a whole wardrobe of suitable possibilities. Ruby's eyes widened, but she quickly pasted over any shock with a smile. "Relax, it's not the end of the world. There's still a few weeks to go. Have you got anything suitable at home?" Faith all but snorted. "Okay, I'll take that as a no. Never mind." Ruby squeezed Faith's shoulder. "There are a few good boutiques in Geraldton, and if there's one thing I do excel at, it's shopping. Come on." Before Faith could argue, Ruby was dragging her past the parked four-wheel drive and into the local shopping precinct. When her mum and Jenny had taken her shopping for a Year 12 ball dress, she'd frustrated them by insisting on wearing a tuxedo. But within moments of stepping into the first boutique, Faith sensed she wasn't going to get away with anything like that this time. In her element amongst the rows of bright-coloured dresses, Ruby scoured the racks like a pro. She looked back and forth, at a dress, then at Faith, plucking seemingly random gowns as she went. Faith became a pack horse, heavily laden until a sales assistant asked if she could put the dresses in a fitting room. "Okay, that'll do for a start." Ruby grinned as she turned Faith towards the fitting rooms. "For a start? That'll keep us going for weeks." Ruby laughed, and Faith found her enthusiasm contagious. She couldn't recall a time she'd gone clothes shopping with a friend. Shopping had just never been her thing, but then again she'd never had a girlfriend to go with. What would usually be a chore proved to be fun with Ruby there for support and advice. "What do you think?" Faith twirled as she stepped out of the change room for the 6th time, now wearing a strapless golden gown that hugged her at the waist and then fell in ruffles to the floor. Ruby's mouth opened, but no words came. "It's too long, isn't it?" Faith struggled with disappointment. She'd fallen in love with this gown the moment she laid eyes on it, but needed to be sensible. "It's not practical." "To hell with practicality." Ruby stood and clapped her hands. "You look amazing! I'm dumbstruck, so I can only imagine how the guys will react." As good as Ruby's words made her feel, there was only one man Faith wanted to dazzle, and if she hadn't been able to do it before now, it'd be silly to pin all her hopes on a ridiculously expensive outfit. "Thanks," she managed through the sadness that arrived with that thought, although I'm not sure I can justify the expense. She trailed her fingers over the silk of the gown, psyching herself up to take it off. "How does it make you feel?" Ruby asked. For a few brief moments, it had made her feel on top of the world. Special. Beautiful, even. "Good. Really good." "Then I can't let you walk away without buying it. Every woman deserves at least one dress that makes her feel like a princess, and if you won't buy it for yourself, I will." Of course, Faith could never let Ruby do such a thing, which is why, in a sort of daze, she found herself handing over her credit card and accepting a gorgeous boutique bag containing the most expensive and beautiful dress she'd ever owned. They stepped out of the shop, and Faith gasped. "I think I just spent the deposit for a small house." Ruby threw back her head in unencumbered laughter and linked her arm through Faith's. "I'd say that calls for a celebration. Hot chocolate?" As they pounded the pavement towards the cafe, Faith decided maybe she'd been too quick to judge Ruby. Maybe she simply was more shy than most. Faith thought back through their interactions and shamefully realised she couldn't find any real evidence to back up the assumptions she'd made about Ruby Jones. The closer they got to the cafe, the more her treatment of Ruby ate at her. By the time they'd ordered and sat down in the plush chairs, she couldn't hold back any longer. "I'm sorry, Ruby." Setting her handbag on the floor by her chair, Ruby looked up, her brow furrowed. "What about? You were great back there. I made you try on a zillion dresses and you didn't roll your eyes once. Well, maybe once." Ruby's light-hearted response gave Faith an out, and she guessed that to be her intention. But her behaviour really had been unwarranted. She thought of her warm-hearted mum. Cassie would never have been so quick to judge a newcomer to town, and that made her more determined to offer a proper apology. I'm so sorry I was such a bitch to you. A light red tinge crept into Ruby's cheeks, and she shook her head. Don't worry about it. I'm sure you had your reasons. I can't for the life of me imagine what they were, admitted Faith. You've been a godsend these last few weeks, helping me with the ball, and who knows what I'd have worn if you hadn't taken the reins today. Ruby smiled. I'm sure you'd have chosen something fabulous. And as for why you didn't like me, may I make a suggestion? Faith blinked and nervously said, Go ahead. I think he starts with M and ends with Y. The waitress chose that moment to deliver their hot chocolates. Faith all but snatched hers from the woman's tray, wrapping her fingers around the mug, drawing warmth and searching for courage. She couldn't bring herself to meet Ruby's gaze. I'm right, aren't I? Ruby persisted. Faith shrugged. Maybe. I was worried you would break his heart. I really can't explain it, but I feel so protective of him. He's my best friend in the world. I think he's a lot more than that, Ruby said. When Faith didn't say anything, she continued. My guess is you're in love with him. Oh, jeez. Is it that obvious? Ruby nodded. To me, yes. But Monty's male. He probably doesn't have a clue. You should tell him how you feel. Nausea reared in Faith's belly at the thought. I don't know if I can, she blurted. He's never given any indication that he feels the same way. I think sleeping with you is a pretty good indication. Faith winced. You know about that? Ruby nodded, but there was no malice in her expression or her words. Why do you think he and I were over before we even began? I'm so sorry. She bit her lip, shame washing over her. Would you quit saying you're sorry? Ruby laughed and picked up her mug. She took a long sip of her drink. I don't know what else to say, Faith replied. She poured sugar into her already sweet hot chocolate and stirred it vigorously. I'm so embarrassed. I promise I never ever meant it to happen, and I certainly didn't mean to hurt you. I feel so ashamed. It's all a big fat mess. Where men are involved, it's always a mess. Ruby waved her hand, as if telling Faith to forget it. And Monty and I were never really together, so technically you did nothing wrong. That's a very generous way of looking at it. Anyway, Ruby mused, what's happened has happened. The difference between you and me is that I'm not in love with Monty. And right now, I could use a friend a lot more than I could use a man. I'd really like it if we could be friends, Faith. The words caught in Faith's throat. I'd like that. And she meant it. Great. Well, now that's settled. Shall we order a big piece of chocolate cake to share? Ruby gestured to the cabinet of cakes behind them. I know we said we couldn't eat another thing, but just look at that selection. Faith followed Ruby's gaze and smiled. Her taste buds danced in anticipation. I like your thinking. She caught the attention of the waitress. Can we have a big slice of that mud cake with ice cream and 2 spoons, please? Now, she said, turning back to Ruby, apart from coping with the town bitch, how are you finding being back in Bunyip Bay? This time it was Ruby's turn to nibble her lower lip. Everyone's been very welcoming, but it's hard getting used to living with Mum and Dad again. So I imagine. Faith desperately wanted to ask why she'd moved back to town and in with her parents, but considering their friendship was mere minutes old, she decided not to push it. They're great, don't get me wrong, Ruby said quickly, but let's say life has thrown me a few curveballs lately, and I didn't expect to be single and living back at home at 26. Tell me about it, Faith giggled wryly. Do you plan to stay in town? To be honest, I don't know. Right now, I'm taking things one day at a time. Fair enough. The chocolate cake arrived, and both their eyes widened at the size of it. I'm thinking if we eat that, we might have to go back to the shop and buy me a bigger-sized gown. Ruby laughed, and they both picked up a spoon. Half an hour later, as they headed back to the 4-wheel drive, Faith decided that what had started out as a terrible day had turned out to be not too shabby at all. This is the end of CD 5. The book continues on CD 6. CD 6. Chapter 20. I've had an idea. Monty turned to look at Adam as they emerged from the machinery shed. Let me guess, since seeding is done and dusted for another year, we should hit the pub to celebrate. He'd been thinking the same thing. This was his last season working with Adam, and he was up for a big night. I'll call Faith and see if she wants to come. Having not seen her since that day in the library, he reached into his pocket for his mobile, welcoming the chance to start getting things back to normal. Adam held up a hand. Hold your horses, mate. My idea is along those lines, but better. Monty cocked his head. I'm listening. Ruby and Mum have finished decorating the cottage, and we're about to start taking bookings. That's awesome. Your mum must be pleased. Adam shrugged. She's not saying much, but I'm hoping she'll venture out of the house a bit more when we have guests staying. Anyway, this might be our last chance to christen the joint. What say we have a post-seeding housewarming going-away party tomorrow night at the cottage? A slow smile spread across Monty's face. Great idea. The pub was good, but nothing was better than a party on the land. They could turn the music up as loud as they wanted and camp out later if they so felt the need. What about a bonfire? As long as it's not too close to the house, Adam said. I'd hate to see it go up in smoke after all our hard work. We'll have it in the paddock. Right. So how about you tell Ruby, Faith, Ryan and anyone else you'd like to invite, and I'll round up some folks too. The beer's on me, but if anyone wants Bundy, they bring their own. Okay. Maybe you can con Faith into helping with the grub. What do you think? For a second, Monty wondered if he was the best person to ask her. Last time he'd tried calling the morning after his breakup with Ruby, she'd all but hung up on him. But he wasn't about to chicken out. Let's have a barbie. Since you're providing the grog, I'll do the meat, and I'll ask Faith to help with salads and make a few desserts. Excellent. Adam rubbed his hands together. We haven't had a good party in ages. Promising to return the next morning to help collect wood and build the bonfire, Monty climbed into his ute. As he prepared to call Faith, he found his palms getting sweaty and his pulse ticking faster. And he shook his head at the ridiculousness of the situation. It was a bit over a week before the barking ball. His parents would be in town next weekend, and Lord knew Jenny would take one look at the pair of them and notice something was up. He'd never been able to lie to her, and as soon as she'd made him spill his guts, she'd make him feel even worse than he already did. Spurred on by that thought, he dug his mobile out of his pocket and made the call he'd been wanting to make for days. Hey, Monty. She sounded happier than she had in a long time, as if he'd caught her in the middle of something fun. Is this a bad time? No, not at all. Female laughter echoed in the background. Okay, then. Well, I was wondering if you'd like to come to Adam's tomorrow night. He's having a party to celebrate end of seeding and the completion of Old Man Sylvie's place. And also as a leaving do for me. Sounds like a lot to celebrate. Did she mean she'd be happy to see the back of him? He laughed uneasily, pushing the thought aside. Does that mean you'll come? Since when would I miss free booze? You guys are providing, right? His heart relaxed at her teasing tone, and for the first time in weeks he thought that maybe things really would be okay between them again. Adam's buying the beer, but there's a catch. Oh? Could you make some salads to go with the barbecue, and maybe a couple of desserts as well? Faith said something, but it was muffled, as if she'd covered the phone. More female laughter followed, and if he didn't know better, he'd say it belonged to Ruby. What's so funny? He asked. Nothing. It's one of those have-to-be-here moments. She took a breath. I take it there'll be more than just us three at this party. Ruby's here now. Do you want me to ask her? Ruby's with you? He couldn't keep the surprise from his tone. Yep, we've been plotting together. For the ball. More laughter. Sure, Ruby's invited, and Ryan, if he wants. Do you need any help with the cooking? She snorted. You're offering to help cook? Don't worry, I suspect Ruby will be far greater help than you. See you tomorrow. Sure. Monty replied to nobody as he stared at the blank screen on his phone. On the one hand, that conversation had been as close to normal as any they'd had in a long while, but on the other it almost felt like she didn't need him anymore. Don't be stupid. He shook his head as he tossed his phone down on the passenger seat and started the ute. Faith was allowed to have friends aside from him. He wanted that. Yet as he drove back to his place, all he could think about was the fact he was supposed to be on that barking ball committee too. Neither Faith nor Ruby had bothered to inform him about this afternoon's meeting. Logically, he knew it was because they didn't want to bother him during seeding, but it still hit a nerve. He hadn't even wanted to be part of the stupid committee in the first place. Trying not to dwell on the Faith and Ruby situation, he headed for the shower the moment he got home. He scrubbed hard and fast, ridding his body and mind of the tension that had built up during the last few strenuous weeks. It was the end. In less than a fortnight, he'd be heading south to Clancy's breakaway, where he'd spend the rest of his days working for himself. His house was half-packed, the moving truck booked. There was no turning back. The thought should have made him feel better than it did. Determined to pull himself from this funk, he turned some music up loud while he dressed. The thought of seeing Faith tomorrow both excited and terrified him. He didn't think he could handle it if he lost the best friend he'd ever had. No, he wouldn't let that happen. At 3 o'clock the following afternoon, country music blared from Adam's iPod docking station on the cottage's veranda, and Monty and Adam sat back with their first beers. "Man, that tastes good." Adam stared at the bottle like it was some kind of god. Damn straight. Monty stared ahead at the woodpile they'd spent the last few hours creating. He couldn't wait till it was late and dark, when everyone would form a circle around the bonfire to roast marshmallows, tell bad jokes, and, depending how much they'd had to drink, sing a few off-tune bush songs. He glanced at his watch. "I swear that's the 10th time you've done that in the last few minutes," Adam said. "Done what?" "Checked the time. Unless you're checking out that ugly mole on your arm." "Shut up," Monty replied good-naturedly. "Anyway, how come moles are called beauty spots on women and they're ugly on men?" Adam chuckled. "Nothing about you is beautiful, mate." Monty shook his head and laughed. Then, without thinking, he checked the time again. Adam snorted. "Are you worried Ruby's not going to show or something?" "What?" Monty dragged his eyes from the long driveway to look at his friend. "Ruby Jones," Adam clarified. "I figure she's the reason you're acting like that crazy rabbit in Alice in Wonderland and checking the time every 5 seconds. You figure wrong. We broke up. Not that we were really ever together. I'm sorry, man, you didn't say." Monty shrugged. "Didn't I? We've been busy." He'd been so focused on worrying about how to right the rift with Faith, it hadn't crossed his mind to mention it to Adam. "What happened?" He hesitated for a second, but decided that he needed to get it off his chest. "Faith happened. We slept together when we were down south." "Holy hell!" Adam almost fell off his seat. "What are you telling me? Are you and Faith together now?" No. Monty shook his head, suddenly aware this news might be as much of a shock to Adam as it was to him, that maybe Adam would be hurt by it. "Faith's like a sister to me, but now everything's weird between us. It's all fucked up and I have no idea what to do about it." "Man," Adam took a slug of beer. "I hoped you'd have some better advice to give than that," Monty grumbled. "You guys had a thing together. How'd you get back on level footing?" "Well, for starters, we only fooled around. We never actually did the big sex. However..." But before Adam could continue, the first car rolled over the horizon. "Look, forget I said anything," Monty said, jumping to a stand. "Don't say anything to Faith, and just pretend you don't know. I want to get things back to normal between us, okay? My lips are sealed." As he squinted to see whose car was approaching, Monty's stomach flipped. How pathetic that he was nervous about seeing Faith. Adam followed him up. "Looks like here comes Normal and Ruby. Let the party begin." Faith's four-wheel drive got closer and eventually parked under an old gum tree in front of the cottage. Monty and Adam went to help unload the food, and as Faith's car door opened, her sunny laughter drifted out from inside the cabin. The familiarity of that sound worked like soothing music for Monty's soul. Excitement stampeded over the top of his awkward nerves, and he smiled at the girls. "Afternoon, ladies. Good to see you both." He couldn't wait to crack open another beer and catch up on everything Faith had been up to these past few weeks. As she climbed out of the vehicle, he noticed she looked different. Although she wasn't as polished as Ruby, who was wearing designer jeans, fashion boots, and a city-ish jumper, he didn't recognise her outfit. Maybe another one she'd bought in her mission to change things in her life. He'd certainly never seen her wear such tight-fitting, soft-coloured jeans to a barbecue before. Her cheeks were rosier than normal too. She wasn't as heavily made up as Ruby, yet she didn't need to be. Natural beauty shone from her smile. "Good to see you too, gentlemen." Faith's tone told him she believed them to be no such thing. "Now give us a hand with all this stuff." The four of them traipsed round to the boot, and Faith peeled back the door to reveal an absolute feast. They spent the next 10 minutes carrying everything inside and setting it up on the trestle table. While they were doing so, more utes arrived, and before long the noise of excited chatter rivaled the stereo. Having lost sight of Faith when she'd gone to greet Ryan, Monty did the rounds inside and out, carrying a beer for each of them. He spotted her chatting with Ruby, Simone, and Frankie. Realising it would be rude to bring only one beer, he went inside for a few more. But when he returned, the others had drifted away, and Faith was on her own. He all but bounded down the steps towards her, not wanting anyone else to intercept. "Hey, Faith, brought you a beer." "No, thanks." She looked down at the 5 he was carrying. "I don't really feel like drinking tonight." "Okay, fair enough." Wondering if she wasn't drinking for fear of doing something stupid again, he put the extra bottles on one of the crates that had been scattered around the garden as makeshift chairs. "So, how's you?" "Fine," she said, offering him what was undeniably a forced smile. His heart ached at this awkwardness between them. "You're all finished seating now?" "Yep, all done. Adam is stoked to have his first season as boss underway, and Mr. Burton seems pleased at the way he handled it. Still, I reckon it'll be hard for him to step back completely." "That's understandable," Faith smiled. "I think no matter what job you do, when the time comes to retire, you'll always have mixed feelings. Farming even more so because it's not just a job, it's a lifestyle." "Yeah, you're right." And suddenly they were talking so normally. "Speaking of retiring, I wonder how Tim and Nora are feeling about leaving Clancy's breakaway." Before Monty could tell her that he'd spoken to Tim a fair bit, Adam walked past them. Faith reached out and grabbed him by the arm. "Great party, mate." "I'll drink to that." Adam lifted a bottle to his lips and took a long slug. "Thanks again for all the food. You should think about starting a catering business or something." "Ha! Let me get the ball over and done with first." "Why aren't you drinking?" he asked, nodding towards Faith's empty hands. "Has this bloke not offered to get you one yet?" "I offered," Monty said, gesturing towards the extra bottles. "I didn't feel like it," Faith replied. "Bollocks!" Adam scooped one up, screwed off the lid, and handed it to Faith. "This here's a party, remember?" "Fair enough," she laughed, and then raised the bottle to her lips. That's when normality took a hike, and Monty caught himself staring at her mouth, watching the way her lips closed over the rim of the bottle, imagining other things they might close over. A few droplets of liquid escaped, running down her chin, and she wiped them off with the back of her hand. He fought a deep desire to reach out and hold her, to kiss her. The intensity of his feelings scared him. Thank God they were in the company of others. Ruby and Simone sidled up to join the group. "Looks like we're missing out on all the fun," Simone said, wrapping her arm around Adam and reaching for a beer. "Hi, cuz. Any hot blokes coming tonight I should know about?" Adam shook his head and rolled his eyes. "No idea." Making a concerted effort to act normal, Monty addressed the 3 women. "So, how are things progressing with the ball?" "Really good," Faith replied. "She's too modest," Simone admonished. "They're awesome. Tickets are sold out, so even before we factor in the raffle and the fabulous things we have to auction on the night, it's been a success. And people are coming from miles around. Faith is going to raise squillions." Faith blushed a little. "I've got a new suit on order," Adam announced, puffing out his chest. "What? You mean you're not going to wear that old corker from your B&S days?" Faith teased. Monty cringed, laughing along with Faith as they recalled what Adam had once called the wonder suit. Pale blue and 2 sizes too small, he looked like Greg from the Brady Bunch whenever he'd worn it. "Nah, I thought it was time for an upgrade," he grinned. "What about you ladies? Got your dresses picked out yet?" Fashion didn't interest Monty, but when Ruby mentioned she'd helped Faith pick out a gown, he almost choked on a mouthful of beer. No one else appeared to think the situation odd. He watched the interaction between his best friend and the woman she couldn't stand only a few weeks earlier, and puzzled at what had changed between them. After another round of drinks, a couple of the Burtons' farm workers asked when the barbecue would kick off. "Don't you know about responsible party hosting?" one of them joked to Adam. "You're supposed to serve food along with the alcohol." The Burtons had just turned up, and Adam wanted to go over and support his mum before the crowd scared her off. Seeing this, Monty offered to get the barbecue started. Simone went with Adam to see her auntie, and Monty returned to the veranda, where he found Ryan nursing a lone bottle of beer. "Evening, Monty," Ryan said. His usual cocky grin spread wide on his face. Monty nodded back. "You finished seeding too, then?" "Yep, yesterday." He smiled and nodded towards the front of the yard. Well, I wonder what the constabulary is doing here." Monty followed Ryan's gaze and saw the new cop approaching from his parked patrol car. He shrugged. "Adam must have mentioned it to him, I guess. Probably just trying to be friendly." "Constable Noble's friendly, all right," Ryan chuckled. He'd stopped next to Faith and the others. Monty watched as the policeman smiled and the ladies laughed at something he said. Faith flicked her hair over her shoulder, and Monty clenched his fists at his side. What could he possibly be talking to her about? "You better watch out," Ryan said. "I reckon the new bloke might have his eye on Ruby." "What?" Monty frowned, his gaze lingering on the exchange. He hadn't considered the possibility that Constable Noble might be interested in Ruby. All of a sudden, he couldn't understand why anyone would look past Faith. Chapter 21. "Nice to see you ladies again. I hope you're watching your speed, Miss Forrester." Drew tipped his head slightly. "Yes, sir." Faith tipped hers back, trying hard to concentrate on the conversation between herself, Ruby, and Constable Noble. She feared the battle a lost cause because she couldn't seem to stop glancing at Monty talking to Ryan near the barbecue. Their gazes met, and she forced herself to smile, even though her insides twisted at the mere sight of him. The longer they'd been apart, the more awkward it felt to see him again, although he didn't seem to suffer the same affliction. He'd never been far from her mind these last few weeks, but seeing him now didn't satisfy a craving, it only made everything worse. For the first time, she felt glad he was moving away. He'd promised to help with the barking ball in any way he could in the next week. But in the name of self-preservation, she planned on putting as much distance between them as possible. "Looks like it's going to be a good night," Drew said. "Pity I'm on duty. Adam invited me and I couldn't resist a quick glimpse of an Aussie party. Really wish I could stick around."
"We'll have to have another one when you're not on duty,"
Ruby said with a coy smile. Drew smiled. "I'd like that," he replied, and then his expression grew serious. He leaned towards them. "Tell me, is it true Adam's got a sister still filed as missing?" Faith blinked, having not expected the question. Ruby frowned. "I don't know much about it. It was long before my time. Faith?" "Yes," she answered in a subdued tone, unsure why he was asking, or how much she should tell. "She disappeared from the farm 20 years ago. The police suspected foul play, but they never found a trace." She looked over to where Adam and Simone lingered at the edge of the party, trying to encourage his mother in conversations. "Is that his mum he's with?" Drew asked. "Yeah. Esther's never been the same since. It was awful for the whole town, but I can't imagine what it must have been like for her." "I see." Drew sighed deeply and scratched the side of his neck, before standing tall again. "I'd best go say hi to Adam and have a look around before I head out on patrol again. You girls have fun."
"We will,"
Ruby promised with another girly smile. "Yeah, see you later." Faith, wondering if Drew meant he was going to look over the renovated cottage or something more, found it difficult to gather her thoughts. As he turned to go, her phone rang.
"Are you going to get that?"
Ruby asked. "Oh, yes, of course." Faith scooped the phone out of her pocket and accepted the call before checking the ID. "Hello?" Moments later, she wished she'd taken a second to do so. "Hi, Faith. Sorry to call on a weekend, but I have some brilliant news." Faith's heart thudded in her chest. Katerina Lamborusco Cunningham. "Yes, Katerina, what is it?" "I'm coming to the ball! I didn't want to say anything until I was sure I could swing it, but I'm coming and I cannot wait to meet your man." "That's... great." Kat's sing-song tone gave her the impression she knew Faith had lied about having a boyfriend and planned on catching her out. Now she'd have her chance. So distracted was she by the first part of Kat's announcement, Faith took a second to register the next. "And I'll need somewhere to stay. Can I leave that in your capable hands? None of the country hotels have good websites, and I do everything online." Faith gulped. All the accommodation within miles was booked for that night, and Kat wouldn't appreciate being shoved on a bus to Geraldton. "Sure, we'll work something out," she said, trying to keep her voice calm, while hoping Kat didn't end up sharing her bedroom. "Fabulous. I'm leaving here on Saturday morning, so I should be up mid-afternoon to help out with any last-minute emergencies." "Sounds great," Faith managed through gritted teeth. A helpful Kat sounded like an oxymoron. "I'm so excited. Call you later in the week. Toodaloo." Kat disconnected, and Faith stared at her phone, only just refraining from hurling it into the bonfire. Who even said toodaloo these days? Who'd ever said it? "I'm taking it that wasn't a good call." A worried expression crossed Ruby's face as she looked to Faith for explanation. Understatement of the century. "Why? What's the matter?" Ruby rested a concerned hand on Faith's arm. Faith looked at her newfound friend. She'd become closer to Ruby than she'd once imagined possible, yet it embarrassed her to confess this to someone who would never need to make up a boyfriend. That was the coordinator of the alumni fundraising contest, Katerina Lamborusco-Cunningham. Ruby screwed up her nose, presumably at Kat's pretentious name. "She's coming up next weekend." "And that's a problem because—" Faith sighed and spilled her guts about the pathetic lies she'd told Kat and her cronies at the old girls' dinner. "I see." Ruby appeared to be stifling giggles. "I'm an idiot. I know I shouldn't give a damn what Katerina thinks of me. But bottom line, she did. She was sick of being plain Jane Faith with the dead-end job, if you could even call working for her tyrant dad a job, and no love interest at all. She wanted people to think she was somebody. Hell, she wanted to be somebody." "Relax." Ruby upped her pressure on Faith's arm. "This doesn't have to be a disaster." "What doesn't have to be a disaster?" "Ugh, just her luck that Monty and Adam chose that moment to return." Close to tears, she lifted her fingers to wipe her eyes, but it was too late. A lone drop escaped, and Monty noticed. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close as he'd done on numerous occasions in the past. But this time it only made her feel worse. "What's wrong?" Monty pressed. "Nothing," she lied, wishing she could shake him off without making a spectacle of herself. Monty, Ruby, and Adam raised their eyebrows. "Kat's coming to the ball." She looked to Monty and saw the exact moment it dawned on him what this meant. Right. Before he or Faith could say another word, Ruby took charge. "It's okay, we can all keep up the facade." "What facade?" Adam asked. Getting to be a right old hand at personal humiliation, Faith brought him up to speed. "So," Ruby suggested, "Monty will go to the ball as Faith's date, and Katerina need never suspect a thing." Faith expected Monty to object. It would probably be for the best. The last time they'd pretended to be an item, things hadn't ended well. But he nodded emphatically. "Yes, that's what we'll do. Happy to help." "You don't have to." She didn't want him to feel obligated. Besides, the thought of struggling through another night of pretending she was only pretending to be in love with him was almost too much to bear. "I want to." Before Faith allowed herself to look for meaning in those words, she recalled the other matter. She also needs somewhere to stay. Where the hell am I going to put her? Everything's booked, and I really don't want her at my place. Not the way Dad's been lately. They all thought for a moment, and then Adam glanced to the cottage. "She can stay here. We weren't sure if it'd be ready in time, so we haven't taken any reservations, but as it happens, we're all set to rock and roll." "Great idea," Ruby and Monty said in unison. "Are you sure?" Faith's heart lifted again when he nodded. "Thanks, mate. Kat will love this old place." "No worries." He patted his stomach. "Anyway, all this problem-solving is making me hungry. We only came over to tell you that Monty's got the sangers burnt to perfection. Come eat and drink some more." Faith had determined not to drink much tonight, but she feared she might need something strong to get her through next Saturday. Monty wasn't stupid. Faith was definitely avoiding him. She'd sat with Esther Burton and Ruby while she ate, yet made an excuse to get up the moment Monty joined them. He'd helped Adam clean up after the barbecue, and whereas Faith would usually be first to volunteer as well, she'd thrown herself into a game of cards with some of the other blokes. Always up for a game himself, he'd joined in as soon as he could, and that's when Faith decided she'd had enough. She left the small circle, muttering something about organising dessert. He watched her now as she sat on a crate with Ryan and a couple of other farmers, digging into a plate of pavlova and laughing at something one of the blokes had said. He hated the way she was more at ease in their company than in his.
"You excited about your move?"
He turned to find Ruby beside him. Resisting the urge to look back to where Faith sat, he forced a grin. "Sure, can't wait." She raised an eyebrow at his less than enthusiastic tone. He couldn't help himself. "You and Faith seem pretty chummy now." Ruby's brow lifted even higher, and a smirk tilted her lips.
"Yes, because I'm no longer a threat."
Lifting a near-empty beer bottle to his mouth, Monty tried to decipher her words. Shopping in Gero, giggling at shared secrets. I'd be forgiven for thinking she is your new best friend.
And I'd be forgiven for thinking you were jealous.
Don't be ridiculous. He downed the dregs. I told you that night was a mistake. Anyway, what did the new cop have to say to you two? She laughed.
"You are so jealous. He caught Faith speeding the other day and was simply checking she'd been more careful since. Oh, and he asked us about Adam's sister. But seriously, you don't have to worry about him."
I'm not worried. It's not like that. He ripped the label off his empty bottle. I just miss her friendship is all. Glancing at his handiwork, Ruby shook her head.
"What are you scared of, Monty? It's pretty obvious that you and Faith are meant to be together. I don't think I ever stood a chance. I don't think anyone does. You're already the best of friends, so you're more than halfway to what most people only ever dream of finding."
Her eyes bored into him as she waited for an answer, but all he could think to say was, "What if we stuff it up?" She shrugged.
"Then you pick up the pieces and move on like so many others have done before you. But if you don't risk it, then what? I think that's the bigger question."
Ruby chinked her glass on the side of his bottle, smiled knowingly, then walked away. As the partygoers flocked towards the bonfire, Monty found himself frozen. Was Ruby right? Was his failure to commit, failure to find that elusive spark with anyone else, all because the person most suited to him had been right beneath his nose all along? Suddenly the idea of socializing felt suffocating. He needed time to think. Knowing he'd already had too many beers to drive home, he set off across Adam's property to clear his head. With each stride, Ruby's words played over and over in his mind. He walked for what felt like miles, trying to imagine his life without Faith in it, but practically all his memories came back to her. He recalled the night he returned to Bunyip Bay after finishing high school. They'd gone down to the jetty and fished until late. When he caught 0 fish to her 5, she teased him about being out of practice. She said the city had made him soft. Somehow she dared him to skinny dip in the ocean, and, wanting to prove he wasn't soft, he'd accepted the challenge. He chuckled at the thought. That was Faith, always up for a laugh, always ready to offer or accept a dare. Walking briskly, he challenged himself to think of 5 childhood memories that didn't include her. He'd spent 8 years in Perth before coming back to Bunyip Bay. Surely 5 memories would come easy. But even when he thought of that time in the city, Faith starred in almost every recollection. Her boarding school had been only a train stop from his house. He'd rushed out of school almost every Friday afternoon and caught the train to meet her. In summer they'd head down to the beach and swim until it got dark, and in winter they'd trek into the city to catch a movie. She'd spent most weekends at his place, and when she did go back to Forrester's Rock, 9 times out of 10 he'd tagged along. They hadn't made any other good friends in the city. He'd never clicked with the boys at his school, because Will was also there and most of the other students, not familiar with autism, were scared of him. It was like if they hung with Monty, they might somehow catch Will's condition. And Faith, totally uninterested in the things most girls her age were, makeup, TV stars, Dolly magazine, hadn't made more than acquaintances at her posh private school. It didn't bother either of them. They knuckled down, focused on their studies, and, outside of school, they had each other. They didn't need anybody else. In Bunyip Bay, he had more friends. He had almost as much in common with Adam as he did with Faith, and he'd made some good mates working on the boats and in the other jobs he'd done. But Faith was his best friend. He stopped walking, realised his shoes had filled with mud. Didn't care. That's what he was scared of. Making a balls up of a relationship and losing the person who meant the most to him, the only person he'd ever needed. Faith. Ruby's words resounded in his head. If you don't risk it, then what? What if he let fear rule his life? What if he didn't confess his feelings to Faith? Maybe because of what they'd done, he'd lose her anyway. All of a sudden it was obvious. He loved her. He always had. But because they'd been so easy in each other's company, he'd almost missed one vital thing. He was also hugely attracted to her. He grinned as his mind filled once again with memories from that night in his tent. She'd shared herself with such abandon. Feasting on her had been the most natural thing in the world. He couldn't go another night, another hour without seeing her, without finding out if there was any hope of more than friendship between them. He turned and started running, charging towards the cottage. By the time he arrived at the house, only a few people lingered. Adam, Simone, and a couple of the Burtons' workers were sitting around the bonfire. But Faith was nowhere to be seen. "Where's Faith?" he asked, interrupting Simone in the middle of a joke. Adam looked up at him. "She and Ryan left hours ago," he replied. "What happened to you? I was just saying we should send out a search party." "I was walking." Without another word, he turned away. He was almost at his ute when Adam caught up. "Are you okay? Where have you been?" "Like I said, walking. Thinking." "About Faith?" "Yeah." Monty stopped and leaned against the ute. "And did you come to any conclusions?" "I love her." His voice broke on the confession. "I have no idea if she feels the same way, but I can't go another night without telling her." Momentum building inside him again, he tossed his car keys in the air. "Wish me luck." Adam snatched the keys before Monty's hand could close around them. "Mate, I wish you all the luck in the world, but I can't let you drive tonight." Monty tensed. "I'm fine, I haven't had a beer in a couple of hours." "That may be." Adam swung the keys around on his finger like this was a big joke. "But it's after midnight. You can't go barging over to Faith's place, waking up her whole family, even if you are safe to drive." "Midnight?" Monty dug his phone out of his pocket to check the time. "Holy shit, I've been out there for hours." Adam patted him on the back. "I've heard love can do that to a guy, make you lose your mind. Forget the time, all sorts of crazy things. Look, why don't you head into the house and steal a bed for the night? In the morning, when you're showered, then you can go over and declare love." Adam's words were a little slurred, and he was speaking much more candidly than usual, but he still spoke sense. Resigned, Monty let his friend lead him towards the cottage. As they walked, a thought struck him. "You don't mind, do you?" "Mind? About what?" "About me and Faith," Monty explained, "if there even is a me and Faith." "Why would I mind?" Monty shrugged one shoulder. "You always liked her." Adam laughed and shook his head. "I had a teenage crush. It's ancient history." "Really?" "Really," Adam echoed. "Seeing you get together, my two best mates in the world, would make me very happy." "I might be getting ahead of myself. There's no guarantee she feels the same way." "True," Adam said. "And that's why first thing tomorrow morning you're going to go over there and find out." Chapter 22. At 6 o'clock the next morning, Faith trudged out to the paddock where Daisy spent her nights, ready for the morning milking. Although she'd escaped Adam's party relatively early, sleep had eluded her. From the moment she'd closed her eyes, she'd been tortured with unrelenting thoughts of Monty. She missed him, but simple friendship seemed a pale substitute for what she really wanted. If the torrid memories of what they'd done together in his tent weren't confronting enough, he'd disappeared last night just before the bonfire started, and her mind had sailed off on a totally different tangent. She had no clue where he'd gone off to, and had almost driven herself insane with trying to work out whether any of the other female guests were also missing. Although she couldn't pinpoint anyone, she'd been unable to get the thought out of her head. The idea of him giving some girl the kind of attention he'd given her only weeks before made Faith heartsick. Thankfully, the busy week ahead would leave little time for wallowing. She wished there was someone she could open her heart to, but in the absence of a likely candidate, Daisy would have to do. As she led the cow into the milking shed, Faith remembered numerous times when she'd been home from boarding school and come into the shed to find her mum talking to their cow. Cassie had always loved having hens for eggs and growing her own veggies, but the milk cows had been more than animals. They'd become friends. When Daisy's last calf was taken by a local farmer, Faith had made the heartbreaking decision to give the old girl a rest, knowing her milk would soon dry up. Her offerings were getting scanter and scanter now, and Faith knew the time would soon arrive when Daisy no longer served a purpose, at least not in her father's eyes. But Cassie had never turfed a cow simply because it ceased being useful, and Faith didn't plan on doing so either. Saying goodbye to Daisy would be like saying goodbye to her mother all over again. "What would I do without you?" she asked as she sat down on the old milking stool and gave the old girl a morning pat. "Who would keep me sane then?" Looking after Daisy had always been a mixed blessing. On the one hand, needing to milk the cow twice a day tied her down, but on the plus side it was those times with Daisy when she felt closest to her mother. Right now she needed that connection. If her heart had been in a mess over any other guy, she'd have confided in Monty or his mother, but even Jenny Montgomery was off limits now. And although it appeared she'd found a friend in Ruby, it felt wrong to talk to her about Monty. "I just wish she could tell me what to do," she sniffed at the cow. As she went through the motions of milking, she contemplated the prospect of confessing her feelings to Monty. She imagined a number of wonderful scenarios, most of which ended with him taking her in his arms and kissing her madly while confessing his own feelings. But the fear of rejection always overruled them. If he wanted her, he wouldn't have written off their night together as a mistake. She was almost at the end of their milking session when the rusty old door of the shed scraped open. Snapping her mouth shut for fear of Ryan or her father hearing her spilling her heart to Daisy, Faith turned her head and almost went into cardiac arrest at the sight before her. Monty. Here. She felt her insides twist with longing as he approached. His hair was still damp from the shower, his legs encased in dark jeans, and his impressive upper body hidden beneath a jumper advertising the Bay Bunyips footy team. Nothing knock your socks off about his outfit, yet he didn't need any dressing up. He was just perfect as he was, and she couldn't believe she'd taken this long to notice. But what was he doing here so early in the morning? Had her anxieties conjured him into reality? She wondered how long he'd been lurking, and if he'd heard anything she'd said. Her toes curled at the thought. Or maybe that was lust. As if this early visit was the most normal thing in the world, Monty strode towards her and proffered a packet of caramel Tim Tams. She frowned and eyed the packet suspiciously. Biscuits? Not just any old biscuits. He tore open the packet, waving it under her nose. She sniffed, meaning to inhale the chocolate, but the sweetness combined with the illicit and delicious scent of him. These are the ones your boyfriend brings, remember? Her heart sank. So that's what this was about. She stared at the packet in his large, strong, work-roughened hands, wishing the ball was over. Not because all her hard work would finally come to fruition, but because then Monty would be gone, and she could begin to put the pieces of her heart back together. Unfortunately, before that could happen, she had a whole night of pretending to be his girlfriend to survive. She turned back to Daisy, resumed milking. "You're not my boyfriend," she told him, "no matter how much I wish you were." "But I want to be." "What did you say?" Her hands froze, and her head snapped up at his words. She'd chop off her ears if they were playing tricks. He looked down at her with a focused and serious gaze. She felt his intensity in every atom in her body, as if tiny matches were being lit beneath her skin. I've been a complete mess the last few weeks. I'm lost without you. The most honest moments of my life were those 2 days I pretended to be your boyfriend in front of Tim and Nora. It felt right, Faith. More right than anything has ever felt before. Her mouth fell open as she stared up at him, unable to believe his words, desperately wanting them to be true, but scared this was just another one of her torturous dreams. Are you going to say something? She refocused on his eyes and saw real fear. It was the kind of fear she'd been feeling these last few weeks, the fear that had stopped her putting her heart on the line, as he'd just done. Shooting to a stand, she knocked over the stool. Ignoring it, she reached out for him. It was the next best thing to pinching herself. I don't know what to say. Her fingers played over the contours of his arms, and she explored smooth, hot skin over taut, sexy muscles, just like she'd done in her dreams. The packet of Tim Tams dropped to the floor. You could start by telling me I haven't just made a fool of myself. His voice was gravelly as he stepped closer. You could say you have similar feelings. Or you could tell me I'm an idiot and that you'll never feel that way. Just say something, please. Oh, Monty. Faith's eyes watered as she swallowed the emotion rushing to her throat. I feel exactly the same. I think I always have. I was just scared to admit it, and I already felt like I was losing you. I know. He captured her hands and brought her fingers to his lips before kissing them. But it suddenly makes so much sense. Before she could reply, he made the gap between them even smaller and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss began chaste and sweet, but somehow felt more intimate than when they were skin on skin in his tent. It felt real, and she couldn't return it fast enough. If she doubted his feelings at all, the way he kissed her now extinguished all such anxieties. She wrapped her arms around his body, and their legs entwined as they indulged in the taste of each other. With each brush of his lips, her core body temperature soared, and the kiss threatened to go beyond a general viewing rating. Summoning every ounce of willpower she possessed, she pulled back before totally losing control. Where to from now? She whispered, wanting to whisk him away to her bedroom, but knowing it wasn't a sensible option, not with her father and Ryan at home. I want to do this properly, he said, caressing the tender skin on the inside of her wrists. If you can spare a few hours this morning, I'd like to take you on an official date. The sensations of his thumbs sweeping over her tender pulse points played havoc with her senses, and she feared she might have heard him wrong. This morning? He glanced at his watch. Right now would be perfect. She looked back at Daisy and decided they were through with milking. Okay, just let me change. Monty performed the head-to-toe once-over, unashamedly looking his fill down her body. His smile grew, and her nipples tightened as need coiled deep in her belly. What you're wearing now will be just fine. Momentarily distracted from her desire, she took a peek at the ancient, faded black track pants she'd pulled on when she rolled from bed, and the oversized jumper she tugged on top of her sleeping tee. No, she shook her head. I need to have a shower. Give me 5 minutes, 10 max. Okay, but don't dress up. Faith laughed. It'll be hard, but I'll do my best. She all but danced to the shower, desperate to scrub herself clean, ready for a brand new, exciting phase of her life. After stripping naked and turning on the water, she pinched herself just to make sure, and the pain brought immense pleasure. To think that in less than 24 hours she could go from rock bottom to feeling as if she could conquer the world. She didn't know how she'd come to think of Monty as more than the boy next door, but she was now ready to relearn him as a lover, as someone whom she might possibly spend the rest of her life with. A warm glow lit inside her at the thought, ignited by the simple thrill of what lay ahead. Monty waited in the lounge room at Forrester's Rock, trying not to think about Faith in the shower. He thought about joining her, and had almost lost the battle of wills, when Frank strode into the room. He paused and did a double take, his gaze settling on Monty. You're here early? Monty nodded. Faith and I are heading out. He bit his tongue on asking Frank's permission to date his daughter. He'd always got along with Faith's dad and respected him as a farmer, but in recent months he'd been unable to condone the way he'd treated her. "Can I get you a couple while you wait?" Frank asked, nodding towards the kitchen. "No need, Dad." Faith walked into the room, a spring in her step, her wet hair trapped in a ponytail, and a wide smile sitting between two rosy cheeks. She'd heeded his directive and wore old jeans, boots, and an oversized knit jumper, an outfit only she could make look sexy. "I'm ready." Their eyes met. Although she was so familiar on almost every level, at that moment Faith seemed to him like the last gift in a game of Pass the Parcel. Finally the music had paused on him, and he couldn't wait to take their relationship deeper. "Good." He cleared his throat and stood. "I'll see you later, Frank. You kids have a good day." "Geez." Faith spluttered as they stepped out onto the veranda. "What did you do to my father? He forgot to wear his grumpy pants." Monty took her hand. "Who cares? I'm much more interested in you." They walked to his ute, and as he opened the passenger door, he mourned the loss of her hand. She peered into the tray at the back, her eyes twinkling as they spotted the fishing gear. "You're taking me fishing?" Excitement shone in her voice. "We haven't been fishing together in an age." "I know. Too long." While he'd been focused on saving for his farm, so many things had fallen by the wayside. But that was all about to change. As they clicked their seatbelts into place, they both seemed overcome with the realization of what they were doing. "Will you laugh if I tell you I'm nervous?" she asked, glancing over at him. "It'd be the pot calling the kettle black, because I'm petrified. My hands have never been this sweaty." "Maybe I didn't notice because mine are sweaty too." She wiped her palms on her jeans. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "When did you start feeling like this? Thinking that maybe we were meant to be more than friends?" He turned the ute out of her drive and onto the road towards town. "In hindsight, I think it's been building for a long time. I've never managed a long relationship because I'd always preferred spending time with you. But that night in the pub, the night you wore that short pink dress, ruined me. I could barely concentrate on anything else. Since then, I've looked at you differently." Although it felt weird confessing these feelings, it also felt right. "Wow, I would have paid 10 times more for that dress if I'd known it had that kind of power." He chuckled. "What about you? If you tell me you've known forever, I'll feel like a dick." "No," she shook her head. "I was as blind as you. The alumni night changed things for me. When push came to shove, I couldn't make up a boyfriend. I could only think of you." He laughed, recalling how pretending to be her boyfriend for Tim and Nora had amplified the feelings he'd started to have. "Thank God for the need to deceive." "And for Dutch courage," she added. "I'd never have had the guts to make a move on you if it weren't for the drinks. That final glass of port tipped me over the edge. We owe Tim and Nora a lot." "Hang on, I was the one who made a move on you." He smiled at her, recalling how he'd been unable to resist getting her naked. She shrugged. "Believe what you like. What I want to know is, where do we go from here?" "Most first dates are about getting to know each other, finding out if a second one is warranted." "But I already know you better than you know yourself, and a second date is non-negotiable." "My feelings exactly. Maybe we should just fast forward a few dates and head for the bedroom. Yours or mine, I'm not fussy." He shook his head, amused by her frankness, and trying to ignore the ball of desire that tightened low in his belly at her words. As tempting as her offer was, they were almost in town. He could smell the sea, and knew if he turned towards his house instead of heading for the jetty, they might never leave. And besides, Monty really did want to spend this time hanging out. He'd missed simply being with her. "The fishing's supposed to be brilliant today." She sighed. "I can see I'm going to have to work on my technique." At Faith's words, he slammed his foot on the brakes and swerved the car over to the side of the road. He turned, leaned forward, and grabbed her face between his hands, drawing her closer until his lips claimed hers. He slipped his hands up into her hair, and they kissed like a pair of randy teenagers until his lungs begged for air. "You have nothing to worry about in terms of technique," he promised. "The sparks I get when kissing you I've never felt with anyone else." Her red, thoroughly kissed lips twisted up at the edges. "Sparks? I thought all that stuff was a load of mumbo-jumbo. Next thing you'll be getting your tea leaves read. Where kissing's concerned, I'm a mumbo-jumbo convert. But that doesn't mean I'll start believing in numerology and all that stuff Mum wastes her time with." She grinned. "I wouldn't expect anything less." Somehow he forced himself to get them back on the road, to head towards the jetty instead of the nearest roadside parking bay, hidden by trees and perfect for making more of those sparks. Even though it was winter, there were already walkers on the beach, fishermen on the jetty, and a few hopeful surfers taking their chances with the waves. Monty parked and met Faith at the back of the ute to unload their gear. For years she'd kept her pink fishing rod, a joke present he'd given her one Christmas, at his place, because they only ever went fishing together. He couldn't think of a better activity for their first date. Despite being laden with tackle, they managed to hold hands as they headed towards the jetty. "I'm going to miss all this," Monty said, nodding ahead. "The jetty and the fish, the early morning swims." In a few months' time, the Bunyip Festival and Undies Run would be happening on the beach, and for the first time in years he wouldn't be taking part in either. "But you'll have plenty of cows," Faith replied, her voice light with amusement. "Trust me, they can be very good company." Chapter 23. "Is there anything you haven't thought of?" Faith asked as Monty laid a picnic rug down on a deserted section of the jetty and started to unpack the esky. When he'd said they were going fishing, she hadn't bargained on breakfast, especially not a breakfast as luscious as this, but when Monty did something, he did it well. "No, I think I've got everything covered." "Of course you do." Faith sat on the rug and let her legs dangle over the edge of the jetty as he poured orange juice into 2 plastic flutes. She'd remember this moment for the rest of her life. "Let's eat before we fish," Monty suggested, as he peeled back the lid on a container of fresh fruit salad. There weren't the plethora of melons and grapes that were available in the hotter seasons, but he'd still managed an impressive selection. Faith smiled her approval. In addition to the fruit, he'd brought Danish pastries and blueberry muffins. She suspected Mrs. O'Neill might have had a hand in the latter, but she wasn't going to break the mood with too many questions. "Good idea. I'd hate to mix the fish food up with ours and get a mouthful of bait." Monty grimaced, then picked up a glass of orange juice and held it out to her. "I know you're not big on champagne, but I hoped we'd have something to celebrate this morning. Although, if you'd turned me down, champagne would have been better to drown my sorrows." No sorrow drowning required. She lifted her glass in the air, oblivious to the people strolling along the jetty behind them. "To us." "Yes. To finally waking up to ourselves." Monty clinked his glass with hers, then leaned in and stole another kiss. The brief brush of his mouth against hers held the promise of so much more. When he pulled back, Faith licked her lips, wanting to hold on to the taste of him, and immediately wolf whistles and cheers erupted on either side of them. She looked left and right, blushing and smiling at the locals, who were applauding their tame show. "About bloody time!" called a retired farmer, who spent practically every daylight hour attached to a fishing rod. "Damn straight!" called another. Within half an hour, everyone in Bunyip Bay would know that they were an item. But for once, Faith didn't mind the local gossip. Were they the only ones who hadn't been able to see that she and Monty were perfect for each other? The locals soon left them alone, even going to the extent of moving along the jetty to give them privacy. Faith appreciated their efforts, but they could have been dancing naked right behind them and she wouldn't have noticed. Monty consumed her every thought. She'd missed him so much these past few weeks, and although being together like this was weird on one level, it felt so easy and right on all the others. With him, she didn't have to pretend to be someone she wasn't. She didn't have to second-guess her actions, wondering if she was being feminine enough. There was nothing they didn't know about each other, and no hidden traps that could pop up and derail their future. "I've missed you so much," Monty said, as if his thoughts matched hers. "I feel like I haven't seen you for months. What have you been up to?" "Well, yesterday I did 2 loads of washing, mopped the floor, made a lamb stew, and very funny, Cinderella. I meant the important stuff." I'll have you know Dad thinks the world will end if I do anything with my life other than cooking and cleaning, if I dare to dream of being something other than a domestic slave. So things are still awkward between you and Frank? Faith made an unladylike noise to show exactly what she thought of that. Awkward? He's been downright horrible lately. The other day I thought he wanted to talk, but that was wishful thinking. He's practically looking for excuses to yell at me now. She relayed the bizarre episode involving her mum's car. He listened, a thoughtful frown on his face. When she'd finished, he wiped a tear she hadn't even realised she'd shed off her cheek and asked, "Is he okay with Ryan?" "He's fine with Ryan, but ever since I told them I expected them to do their bit around the house and mentioned maybe looking for another job, finishing my degree, he's been impossible. He was distant before then, but now he's nasty. He's like a different person." It's weird, all right. Frank's always been a reasonable man. I wouldn't have pegged him as a chauvinist. He and Ryan may have taken advantage of you a bit the last few years, but that's because you've looked after them so well. I never expected it to get ugly. Ryan's been great. Faith rushed to stick up for her older brother. But Dad... Her voice drifted off as she realised she didn't want to talk about this right now. As much as she appreciated Monty's support, she didn't want anything ruining this perfect day. Let's just forget about him. At the same time, Monty asked, "Do you think there might be something deeper going on? Something more than not wanting you to be involved in the farm?" She frowned. Like what? Maybe he's depressed. Depressed? About what? He has it easy. Our farm's doing fine, and between the men's shed, the Lions Club and golf, he's got an all-right social life. I'm the one who worries about whether he's clothed and fed. I wish I knew. Maybe it has something to do with your mum. She's been gone almost 8 years. We all miss her, but life has to go on. Even as Faith said this, her brain started ticking. Did her dad need to talk about Cassie as much as she did? Was their mutual silence, avoiding the topic, slowly ruining them all? Monty reached out and took her hand. "Do you want me to ask him? I hate seeing you so upset about it." "No." The thought panicked her. She could just imagine how much worse her father would be if he thought she'd been talking about him. "I'm fine. It'll be okay." "Talk to him," Monty said. "Give him the chance to explain. And if he hasn't got a reason, tell him you're moving south with me." He tacked the last bit on as if he'd just said, "Tell him you won't put up with it anymore." Her heart jolted in her chest. She met his gaze. "What did you just say?" He grinned. "I want you to come with me. Not straight away. I know you'll need time to tie things up here, sort things out with Frank. But I'm serious about you. About us. I wouldn't risk our friendship for a week of fun before I leave. You know that, right?" She nodded, and her eyes twitched with unshed tears. Happy ones. "I want to come with you too," she said, her words choked with emotion. "I can't imagine ever wanting anything more." Phew. He wiped a hand dramatically across his brow, leaned forward, and kissed her again. Warmth flooded down from her ears to her curling toes. He'd kissed her 3 times so far, 4 if she included that night in his tent, and each time it had been so unbelievably hot that she didn't think it could get any better. Each time she'd been wrong. As his mouth flirted with hers, fireworks exploded all over her body. Feeling as if she might catch alight at any moment, she forced herself to pull back. She took a breath, drawing much-needed oxygen into her lungs. "Now, you know that week of fun you mentioned? Can we start that soon?" He linked his fingers with hers and leaned close again to whisper into her ear. "Just so I'm clear, you're not talking about fishing, are you?" "Not at all." Right then, she'd happily have tossed all their fishing tackle into the water. She'd never felt so wanton in her life. Catching on quickly, Monty pushed himself up, offering her his hand. "Grab what you can," he said, stooping to gather their things. As if a tsunami were about to hit the coast, they frantically packed up, leaving only a few bits of fruit for the seagulls. Charging back along the jetty, they grinned ridiculously at the people they passed, then threw the esky into the back of the ute with the fishing gear, not caring when it fell open and spilled bait and biscuits all over the tray. Monty drove like a maniac the short distance to his place, and Faith sent a quick prayer skywards that Constable Noble wasn't out and about. In her state, the new cop might have had to arrest her for assaulting a police officer if he'd tried to slow them down. And then they were there, Monty's house, the place she'd stayed numerous times before. Only this time he gripped her hand as he led her inside, and it wasn't to the ratty single bed in the spare room. She scanned his bedroom, a double bed, a plain black doona, a milk crate with an IKEA lamp, and an old wardrobe he'd bought from the op shop in town years ago. His floor was scattered with clothes he hadn't got around to washing or packing. Now his hands were on her waist, teasing the flesh beneath her jumper. But they could have been in a dump site in the dodgiest suburb in Australia and she'd have given herself willingly. This was what she'd been waiting for her whole life. "Are you okay?" Monty's hand stilled as he looked anxiously into her eyes, not having second thoughts. She put her hands on top of his and squeezed. "Not at all. I think I might just be a little shell-shocked. This has all happened so fast." "Too fast?" He pulled back, worry turning his smile lines upside down. "No." She shook her head. Unsure how to put her exact feelings into words, she kissed him instead. But where their earlier kisses were almost frantic, this one was hot and slow, full of promise and potential, and the kind of chemistry that sent a rush of molten gold through her body. As if in one mind, they walked backwards towards his bed, collapsing silently on top of the mattress, his mouth not leaving hers for a moment. "This is my best friend," Faith thought. "I'm about to sleep with my best friend, and it is the most perfect, most natural thing in the world." This time, they both knew exactly what they were doing. While the Bush Telegraph raged with rumours of Faith and Monty's kiss on the jetty that morning, the stars of the gossip barricaded themselves in Monty's house. He needed to pack, and she had work to do for the barking ball, but nothing was more urgent than simply being together for a while. Lying back in his bed, watching episodes of Top Gear and The Chaser on YouTube, while munching Samboy chips, more Tim Tams, and drinking Coke, Faith never wanted this day to end. "You really are the perfect girlfriend," Monty said, stroking her hair as she snuggled against his bare chest. "Most other women would want to watch Desperate Housewives or The X Factor." She shuddered at the thought, but beamed at his use of the word girlfriend. "It doesn't worry you that I'm not very feminine?" she asked. She still couldn't help comparing herself to Ruby, who was the epitome of femininity. "Faith." His tone was serious. "You may enjoy sport and being outdoors. You may be able to drink beer with the blokes, and you may not be interested in fashion, but you are definitely all the woman I want." Sighing at his answer, she tried to push aside her feelings of anxiety. Monty liked her as she was. Nothing else mattered. Mid-afternoon, Faith texted Ryan and begged him to milk Daisy that evening, then promptly forgot about the world outside. Every time a show finished, Monty would unceremoniously dump his laptop on the makeshift bedside table and turn his attentions back on her. No one had ever made her feel as utterly cherished as he did. Each time they made love, she felt thoroughly spent. But all it took was a half-hour episode of one of their favourite shows, and she was itching to get into his pants again. Well, figuratively speaking, because neither of them had bothered putting their clothes back on after the first time. As the credits rolled on the third episode of The Chaser they'd watched that day, Monty gathered Faith into his arms. "Do you want to know the bad news?" Her heart thudded to a stop. "What?" "We've run out of chips and chocolate. We may have to get up and scavenge." She relaxed again, happy that the news wasn't serious. They may have eaten nothing but junk since the fruit that morning, but she felt nourished beyond belief. "I can't believe you're still hungry after all that." She gestured to the empty wrappers littering the floor. He patted his barely there stomach. "What can I say? I like my food." "Come on then." She peeled back the doona and climbed out of bed. "I'll take a quick shower and then let's see what I can throw together from the disaster that's usually your kitchen cupboards." "Did you mention shower?" Monty grinned. "In the interest of water conservation, I insist we share." She She couldn't help but stare at the picture of perfection before her. Completely naked, Monty sat confidently in the middle of the bed as he waited for her answer. Her mind came alive with visions of them together in the confines of his tiny shower, hot water pouring over the two of them, soap suds, his muscles slippery beneath her touch. Her skin practically fried with anticipation. Race you. I could get used to this, Monty said, sipping a beer as he leaned against the kitchen bench and watched Faith work her magic. She glanced up from chopping onions and smiled. Which part? You cooking in my kitchen, sleeping in my bed, sharing my shower. Her cheeks glowed the most beautiful crimson, but typical Faith, she made a joke. I don't think much sleeping occurred, and I've always cooked for you anyway. Yeah, you have. And that's why this is so perfect, he thought, taking another sip. They were so at ease in each other's company already. The only thing different about their relationship now was the sex. That phrase, best friends with benefits, came to mind, and he silently thanked the man upstairs for showing him the light. Will you stay the night? I promise not to get up to too much mischief, but I don't want to say goodbye yet. I want you to be the first thing I see tomorrow morning, just so I know I didn't dream today. Who'd have thought you could be so romantic, she quipped, and although she turned her attentions back to the cooking, he saw a smile threaten to burst off her face. He had to admit, his sentiments surprised him also. Complaining? He asked before taking another sip of beer. No. She dropped the knife on the bench and closed the small distance between them. She fell into his arms and hugged him with the kind of strength you didn't expect from a woman. And it felt right. Her breasts squished against his chest, her head rested on his shoulder, and her hair tickled the bare skin at the back of his neck. She smelled of his soap and his shampoo, but they'd never smelled this good before. Eventually she pulled back. I wasn't planning on leaving anyway, she said, with a wicked glint in her eyes. He laughed, kissed her again, and then let her concentrate on the omelette. As they sat down to eat, he told her what he'd always known. No one cooks like you do, Forrester. Maybe that's why your dad doesn't want you working on the farm. You'll have less time to feed him. She didn't get the chance to answer because his mobile started ringing. Ignore it, he said, picking up his fork to take the first bite. He should have turned it off. You know she'll only ring back. Faith recognised the whale song ringtone as his mum. She smiled as she looked at his phone, vibrating where he'd left it earlier on the kitchen table. The phone went silent and then started moaning again seconds later. Right now he hated that whale music. Groaning, he dropped his fork and snatched up the phone. Hi, Mum. Good evening, sweet pea, she chirped. Have you had a good day? He glanced at Faith across the table. Yes, actually. Best day ever. You? So it's true! Mum all but cackled down the phone line. What's true? That you and Faith are finally an item! He was gobsmacked. How the hell did you find out? Faith laughed. Bunyip Bay's a small town, honey, and I've still got quite a few friends up there. Just because we don't visit as much as we'd like doesn't mean I don't keep in touch. I'd have called earlier, but the phone's been running hot. Bunch of busybodies, he muttered, although he wasn't really angry. Are you surprised? Surprised? She laughed. More like relieved that you finally got your act together. I can't wait to see you both next weekend. Next weekend? The barking ball, honey. She laughed again. Geez, you are totally lost in that bubble of love, aren't you? Yes, he thought, but no way was he admitting that to his mother. I was thinking we could have a barbecue at your place on Friday night and invite Pippa and her folks too. At the idea of a family get-together, his chest tightened. Who's Pippa? Will's girlfriend, said his mother and Faith at the same time. Faith knew a lot more about his family than he did, but he couldn't really blame her. She was much better at keeping in touch. I see. And Will's okay with coming to the ball? He couldn't imagine his brother, who found it difficult to even make eye contact with strangers, embracing the idea of a social event as big as the barking ball. If it were for any other cause, he was sure Will wouldn't even contemplate it. He's very excited. Pippa and her parents are coming up for the weekend. They're staying at the B&B. You'll like Pippa's parents. They're very down to earth, not at all like me. I like you just the way you are, Mum. You're too sweet, my darling. Anyway, I was thinking you could buy the meat in town and I could make the salads. I'll have to slow down a minute. Monty was still coming to terms with the idea of Will having a girlfriend. He'd spent precious little time with his family the last few years. Christmas and Mother's Day lunches and the odd weekend in Perth. And the brother he'd grown up with had struggled to make polite conversation with most people, never mind develop a bond strong enough to form a relationship. Does Pippa have autism too? Is this thing serious? Yes. Like Will, Pippa has high-functioning autism. They met in a behavioural therapy group, and their tutor is so pleased with the connection they've made. It's quite remarkable. Jenny sniffed as if choking back tears. I'm so proud of him. I get tingles every time I think about them together. I can't wait for you to meet her. Neither can I, Monty said, now genuinely curious to see how his brother interacted with a woman. They went briefly through the arrangements. Will, Jenny and Stuart were staying the Friday and Saturday nights at the ball. He'd let his parents have his double bed and give his brother the spare room. He'd take the couch. What's that fabric softener you wash Will's sheets with? Is there anything else I need to organise? Not really. Jenny sounded as if she were thinking aloud. We'll bring our own food to cope with Will's intolerance, and as for that other stuff, he's moved on from most of that. He can even cope with a vacuum cleaner now. Monty's mind flashed back to the times he'd had to take his brother out into the backyard to play so his mother could get the housework done. The vacuum cleaner wasn't the only thing that could set him off. The sound of the broom swishing along the kitchen tiles had also been known to send Will into a meltdown. Monty yawned. Whether it was the exertion of the day catching up with him, or whether he was simply exhausted by the thought of all the hard work Will had been over the years, he couldn't say. He loved Will. He really did in his own strange way, but he'd been happy to distance himself when he left home. Every now and then he wondered what would happen when his folks eventually passed away. The thought of being Will's next of kin terrified him. He'd not shouldered that sort of responsibility in a very long time. His mum laughed, thankfully not privy to his thoughts. I can see I'm boring you when you'd much rather get back to Faith. Tell her I'll call during the week. I can't wait to show her the gown I've bought for the ball. I wavered when I saw the price, but then I thought, what the hell, I deserve it. You do, Mum, you really do. Not once in his life had Monty heard his parents complain about their lot, but surely they must have felt some of the resentment he did. Thanks, darling. Right, I'd better get dinner on for your father. I'll call you on Friday morning just before we leave. All right, Mum. See you soon. Faith had finished her omelette while he'd been speaking to his mum. His had gone cold, but still tasted unbelievably delicious. No one else could make eggs, cheese, ham, and a few onions taste this good. He ate the whole thing in about 5 mouthfuls, and then made Faith lean against the bench with a beer while he did the washing up. Finally, he led her back into his bedroom, where he could forget about family barbecues and concentrate on the only thing that mattered: being with her. This is the end of CD 6. The book continues on CD 7.